This is Ray Eberling with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida with our Veterans History Project, talking today to
Peter Mahoney.
Okay, and these oral histories also will go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Today is February 16th, 2021. And Peter, thank you for introducing yourself, and let's get started. Could you please tell us when and where you were born?
Sure, I was born on September 9th, 1948. That was the night that Rex Barney pitched a no-hitter for the Brooklyn Dodgers against the New York Giants, which my father managed to tell me many times. And I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
And did you grow up in Brooklyn?
Not really. I lived for maybe about my first year or so. My father was a World War II veteran, and he was born and lived in Brooklyn for most of his life. When he came back from World War II, there was some veterans housing in a place called Gerritsen Beach, which was a neighborhood in Brooklyn, and we lived in my first year or so of life. We lived in an apartment in that housing complex. Subsequent to that, my father used one of the few veterans benefits that he ever used, which was the GI mortgage. And we bought a house, the family bought a house out on Long Island, out in a town called Williston Park. And we moved out there when I was about 1 or 1.5.
Okay, since we are talking about your parents, could I get their names and
Sure.
What they did for a living and, a little bit about their background?
Sure. My father's name was Joseph Richard Mahoney. He was his job was he was a ship fitter, so he worked in shipyard. Basically, did the metal work on ships. He worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard for many years, and then in the early '60s, a lot of the shipyard, the ship work. Went south, primarily to get away from the unions in the north. So subsequently, my family ultimately, after I had left them, essentially, moved to the south, and my father basically following his job. He was an underwater demolition team, a frogman during World War II. He never. It's interesting because a lot of the men that he served with, they came back. They used the GI Bill to get the education benefits. They became lawyers. His best friend was a criminal lawyer in New York City. Chief operating officers, chief executive officers of companies. And my father never did any of that. And he basically just went back. He had worked in the shipyard before he joined the Navy, and he went back to the shipyard afterwards. So my mother was essentially a housewife, Julia Victoria Mahoney. Her maiden name was Eller. But us being a good Irish Catholic family, there ended up being 7 children. So my mother worked at various times as all kinds of different jobs. She was a meat cutter in a supermarket. She drove a school bus. She sold Avon. Basically, none of it was particularly a career, but it was trying to earn some additional money to keep the family going.
So with 7 children in the family, where were you in the order?
I was the oldest boy, second oldest child. I have an older sister. There's 5 boys and 2 girls in the family. I have an older sister, Kathleen. My next youngest brother is my brother, Henry, who's probably the one who's closest to me. Then after that came Martha, then Joseph, then Timothy, then Brian.
Any others serve in the military?
My brother Joe was in the Navy for a little while. Unfortunately, got a bad conduct discharge.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, he punched an NCO.
How about from your parents' generation? Any others served in World War II or around then?
Yes, actually, I'm named after my father's older brother, Peter, who was killed during World War II. He was basically in the Air Force. He was in a bomber over Europe in 1945, and he was shot down and killed. My brother Henry was named after my mother's cousin, Henry, who was also killed during World War II. And again, he was also in a bomber that was shot down.
Okay, just for my own purposes, what crew position were both your uncles?
Honestly, I don't really know. I think my my uncle Peter he wasn't the pilot. I think he was a co-pilot. But I'm honestly not sure what my uncle Henry was.
Okay. Well, you said you grew up on Long Island, so did you go through grade school there and high school?
I went through grade school. I always attended Catholic schools. My family was very strongly Catholic. So we lived in Williston Park until I was, I think, in the 4th or 5th grade. Attended St. Aidan's School in Williston Park. Then, of course, as more and more children started to appear in the Mahoney family, we basically outgrew the house that we had in Williston Park, and then subsequently my family moved out to Comac, which is out in Suffolk County, which is the county that's further out away from New York, to a larger house there. And then I attended St. Anne's Grammar School in Brentwood, which was the next town over from us. Comac at that time was basically was just starting to be suburbanized, and we were among the first who moved out there. But it was all potato farms and woods, which was great for a young kid. But so it didn't have there was no Catholic school there. So we managed to get into the Catholic school in the next town over in Brentwood. I then actually, when my high school, I went to a minor seminary, St. Pius X Seminary in Uniondale, New York, which was basically in Nassau County. I used to get on the bus at about 5:30 in the morning. And take a bus ride all the way into Nassau County in order to attend the seminary. So I studied to be a priest for 3 years, and then probably in about my second year, I discovered girls, and that was pretty much the end of my my vocation.
So you were actually at the secondary school level, and they had a program. I'm not Catholic, so you have to help me here a little bit.
Sure.
They actually had a program where like you're 14, 15 years old, and it was like a preparatory program for the priesthood at that age.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess one of the things that sort of, soured me on the whole thing, was just this, the idea that they're starting you at like 12, 13, 14 years old. And one of the rules of the seminary is that you can't have a girlfriend, and if you get caught having a girlfriend, you get kicked out of the school. And it just didn't make sense to me that, so here you are, one of the major roles of a Catholic priest is marriage counseling, and I couldn't understand how are you supposed to be able to be a decent marriage counselor when essentially you're not supposed to have had any contact other than with female relatives since you were 13 years old. So anyway, so that among many other things was one of the, it was sort of the first of a series of many situations where I become interested in something, in the ideal of something. But then the more I find out about it, then the more I realize that reality is not even close to the ideal, and then I become disenchanted. So,
okay, I'd like to stick with still the adolescence. You're growing up in Long Island for just a moment. A couple of things. Was that sort of a desire of yours to consider the priesthood? Was it more your parents channeling you? Something different?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, I had a fair amount of, of sort of religious fervor of my own. Again, I've generally been throughout my life an idealist of one sort or another. And, and so one of the first ideals that I sort of latched onto was religion. Certainly, knowing how much it would please my mother, particularly my mother, if I went to the seminary, played a part in my decision. Probably a big part, but I basically made I made the choice myself. But certainly knowing that it would please her very much played a large role in the decision that I ultimately made.
So I assume that was an all male school that you were attending.
Yes, it was.
Okay. And no arranged dances with the girls' Catholic high school or anything like that, at least for that place.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No.
Well,
just for the record, between my junior and senior year, by my junior year, I pretty much knew that it wasn't for me. But I didn't know how to excuse me, how to relay that information to my parents. Then by chance, basically between my junior and senior year, my father lost his job. They basically closed down the Brooklyn Navy Yard where he worked. It was one of the sort of cost-saving measures of the early '60s, and so he ended up getting a job with General Dynamics up in Quincy, Massachusetts. So my family moved up to the New England area. We originally lived in Rhode Island for the first year before they finally bought a house in Massachusetts. But during that, my senior year, I basically attended again an all-boys Catholic high school in Warwick, Rhode Island, called Bishop Hendricken. But it was not a seminary, and it provided the easy out for me in terms of not having to sort of announce that I was no longer going to go to the seminary, just like allowed the situation to develop by us moving and then just going to a different school.
My other question about your childhood and I guess younger adolescence is, your family moved to Long Island right at the post-war building boom that, like you mentioned earlier, getting a GI Bill house mortgage your parents got. You were probably not too far from Levittown, which is the stereotypical town we think of during that era. Very general question: what was it like growing up on Long Island during that idealized era? That we read about so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I look back on it, there were all kinds of, advantages for a young kid growing up. The Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Little League. There were all sorts of things that were available to. When we moved out to Comac, like I said, it was a young boy's dream. I mean, it was like farms and woods, and also, we lived in a housing development that was at that time being built. So, in addition to to woods and farms and nature and everything, we had all of these half-built houses that we could go running through and playing around in and stuff like that. But I have to say that it's interesting because now, as an adult, with a lot of the changes that I ended up going through in my life, the place I feel least comfortable living is suburbs. I would rather live in the middle of the city, or where I currently live now, in the middle of the woods. But the suburbs, even though that's where I grew up, it's where I feel least comfortable. And I guess the thing that I was never really comfortable with was the sort of the keeping up with the Joneses element of suburban life, which is that everybody's trying to, one of the dynamics of any kind of a suburban neighborhood is everybody's trying to outdo everybody else. That mine is better than yours. I have more Christmas lights on my house. I've done more, I have a patio and you don't. I have a swimming pool and you don't. My car is better than yours. all of those kinds of things. And I guess part of the reason why I never liked it is because we couldn't keep up with the Joneses. You know?
And this was also the case where you moved to in Rhode Island then, or pretty much a similar situation?
Something similar. It was, it wasn't a housing development as such, but it was basically suburban life, and frankly, as an adult, ultimately when I had children of my own, I ended up gravitating back to the suburbs for about 10 years, simply because that's where the best schools were. And at that point, I was willing to sacrifice my feelings about living in the suburbs to make sure that my kids could go to a good school.
So I believe you would have graduated sometime around the year 1966 or somewhere around there. I'm curious because I know at that point, as far as world events, we were post the start of the Tonkin Battle of Tonkin, or the Tonkin incident in 1964. You're graduating in 1966. Were you and your friends at that time developing any thoughts about the war at that point? And also, were there recruiters invited to the high schools, or maybe because of yours a Catholic, they did not, but I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah, I never saw recruiters in any of my high schools. At that time, at graduation, I really didn't think that much about the Vietnam War or what was going on. Number one, I was focused on going to college, so I would get a student deferment from the draft. And the assumption always at that time was that this was this little, thing that was happening over there somewhere. It was going to be over. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't something that anybody particularly worried about, or certainly in where I was, we weren't. It wasn't something that was high on our priority list or worry list or anything like that. It was something that was unconnected to us, and we, again, I was focused on. I was the first one in my family to go to college, and I was focused on my education, and military or Vietnam or anything of that was like totally off my radar at that point.
Okay, so you did what we used to call, I believe, the 2S deferment for full time college student. Where did you wind up going, and what were your major and career aspirations at that point, if any?
Well, in keeping with my the manner of my essentially my education, I went to a Catholic college at that time, all boys college, Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. It's subsequently become co-ed, and I think it's lost a lot of its. Although it's still considered a Catholic school. Yeah, I think it's kind of lost that element to it for the most part. I don't know if I had any particular. I didn't have any career goals that I can remember. I mean, I was going to major in English, which had absolutely no career associated with it other than perhaps teaching it at some point. But I wasn't thinking about being a teacher. But I liked English. I liked literature. I liked reading. I liked writing. So I wasn't thinking, what can I make money at? I was thinking, what do I like, and that's what I'm going to do. And so that was English. So I didn't have any particular career aspirations, one way or another at that point. So I went. I ended up attending Providence College for about a semester and a half. My first semester, I made the dean's list, unfortunately for me, one of the benefits of making the dean's list in your first semester is that you had unlimited cuts in classes the second semester, which I then proceeded to take. So I pretty much stopped going to class. And so by about halfway through the semester, there was no way I was going to catch up or be able to pull it back together again.
Mhm.
So I ended up, I kind of used a little, I had a small fender bender with my father's car, and I used that as an excuse I basically dropped out of school and started hitchhiking around the country. And,
Knowing that you had lost your 2S deferment or would lose it, and you would then become vulnerable for the draft, or
pretty much, yeah. And I mean, I didn't totally focus on that. I mean, it was sort of in the back of my mind. But I guess I was a little bit, I was bored. I had been sort of doing what I was supposed to do for all of my life up to that point. And I guess I was looking for a little adventure. I was looking for to do something that was not what I was supposed to do necessarily, but just just an adventure. I wanted an adventure. So I hooked up with a friend of mine from, it was by pure chance. I was going to visit an old girlfriend down on I hitchhiked down from Providence, from Rhode Island down Long Island to visit an old girlfriend down there. And she basically told me to get lost. I was actually hoping that she would somehow talk me out of what I was doing, because I was having second thoughts about it. And so she had, she more or less told me that she could care less what I did. And I was just kind of walking down the road, kind of thinking, well, gee, what am I going to do? Maybe I should just hitchhike back home, and then suddenly this guy. This car comes by and starts beeping the horn, and I see a guy waving, and it was this old friend of mine from when we were basically he had there were two newspapers on Long Island. There was the Long Island Press and there was Newsday, so we were both paper boys together. He delivered the Press, and I delivered Newsday. And and we both had the same, we essentially had the same routes, but like different customers. We were very good friends. Then we kind of lost contact with one another. So then he somehow he recognized me as I was walking down the side of the road, and so said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, gee, I guess I was kind of thinking of hitchhiking around the country." He said, "Oh, that's a great idea. I'll come with you." And that's all I needed. I just needed, a buddy. For the road. So so we hitchhiked down to to Florida. Our basic idea essentially was we'd hitchhike until we ran out of money, then we'd stop somewhere, work for a while, save some money, and then move on. So we went down to Florida. We actually ended up in West Palm Beach. We ended up getting jobs as busboys at the Bath and Tennis Club in Palm Beach, Florida, which was great because we didn't make a lot of money, but they provided room and board, so we didn't have to pay for housing or food or anything. And actually, by the time we got to Florida, we kind of started figuring that the hitchhiking thing wasn't a great idea, just because we had some incidents along the way that made us think that maybe hitchhiking wasn't the best way to get around. So we started looking around to maybe buy a car, and we ended up finding this 1953 Cadillac hearse. It was painted canary yellow with a black vinyl top and these like silver Landau bars on the side, and so we ended up buying the hearse. And we drove the hearse over to New Orleans, and we basically ran out of money in New Orleans. So we stopped there for a while. I got a girlfriend in New Orleans. My friend, Mark, it was kind of, and so I was kind of settling in, I had a girlfriend, and I had a couple of jobs. I worked at a Burger King restaurant, and then I was also working as as an apprentice repairman for the National Cash Register Company. So ultimately, my friend Mark just felt like, he was through with his adventure, so he just got on a train and left. And shortly after that, I was in touch with my parents. My parents were not, particularly my mother, were not happy with what I did, because I basically left the house without even telling them that I was going. Mm-hmm. So my mother informed me that the draft board had been trying to find me because they were, I had lost my student deferment and they were looking to draft me. And so I was thinking, well, do I want to get drafted? And then I thought, well, like maybe if I join, I'll have a little bit more say over, what happens to me. So I ended up, so I went down to the recruiter's office down in New Orleans and joined the Army. And this was in April of 1968, right shortly after the Tet Offensive.
And I am curious how you happened to select the Army. I know you had a 3-year option in the Army, and I think the Navy and the Air Force, it had to be 4. But was that in your thinking, or were there other things in your thinking about choosing the Army?
No, I knew I didn't want to choose the Navy. I guess I felt, at that time, the idea, when Vietnam was certainly becoming a higher on my radar as far as something that was out there that perhaps I was going to get involved in one way or another. Mm-hmm. Again, part of what was going on for me at the time, there were a lot of different things. Number one, there was this sort of patriotic ideal that I had. I had to do my part. My grandfather served in World War I. My father and uncle served in World War II. Vietnam was my war. That was part of my thinking about it. The other part was that, I wanted to, being a soldier is the sort of the classic way of proving your manhood kind of thing. And there was certainly a big element of that for me in the choice. And I guess, at this point, I can't remember how conscious the decision was, but certainly I was figuring, well, if I go into the military, then Vietnam is out there. And I figured, well, if I'm going to go into the military, then I want to get the full military experience. And the armies were the guys who were in Vietnam. Obviously the Marines were too. But I don't know, somehow the Marines I was never attracted to the Marines. And so the Army was where the action was. And so that had an element of why I decided to join the Army.
And so the fact that you went to recruiter and volunteered rather than wait to be drafted, did at that time they kind of go over, is there a particular career field you wanted to look at? And if so, what is it? Did you have any idea at that point?
The only thing I wanted to do was go airborne. I didn't sign up for any specialized school. I took all the tests. The guy said, basically, you can go to any school you want to. I said, the only choice that I made was I wanted to go airborne. Mm-hmm. Again, because I was into proving myself. And also part of what I was doing in those days was I wanted to do the things that I was afraid of. And I am deathly afraid of heights. I get vertigo. I cannot, if I'm walking across the bridge, that's over, that's high up in the air. My knees start getting weak. I can't deal with height. And I couldn't then. And so it's like, well, let's jump out of airplanes. That's a good idea.
So again, I guess there's very little time from the time you made that decision, walked into the recruiter's office to the time you had to report.
Yeah, very little. A couple of weeks at the most. Yeah, a couple of weeks at most. And so I went to the recruiter station in New Orleans, and then basically got on a bus and went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is someplace in more upstate Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And I remember, one of the things I remember on the bus was, I sort of grew up in this more or less homogenized, sort of Catholic suburban upbringing situation. And so, we didn't use bad words, damn was maybe the worst thing that I ever heard. And, and suddenly I'm on the bus and it's like this, fuck, motherfucking, motherfucking. Every other word that out of everybody's mouth is fucking, and it's like, well, I joined in, and my vocabulary has basically never changed from that bus ride to Fort Polk. Anyway, when we got to Polk, there was, first thing you go into the reception station, where they shave your hair, give you the your uniform and stuff, and a lot of the in-processing paperwork and whatever, and you're taking all these tests and everything. And so after one of these tests, they about 4 guys, they called out our names, brought us into another room, and said, okay, you guys just qualified for officer candidate school. Do you want to go? I didn't have a freaking clue, about officer candidate school and one of the things they also said was that if you go to officer candidate school, you're not guaranteed to get jump school afterwards. You can ask for it, but you may or may not get it. And that, and going to jump school was a big element of what I wanted to do in the military. So that gave me great pause. Luckily, we didn't have to make the decision right then. Mm-hmm. They gave us a couple of days to think it over. And I think probably on the one hand, officer candidate school is supposed to be really rough and tough and, really hard to get through. And so, that was appealing to me in terms of where my head was at that time, because I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to push myself. I wanted to see how far I could go. So all of that was appealing to me. The fact that I might not be able to go to jump school was a detriment. The other thing was that I didn't then, and I probably have never really considered myself to be a leader, although in many different situations in my life, I've ultimately sort of fallen into leadership roles in one way or another, but I've never really felt that I'm a leader. And at the time I was barely 19 years old, and the idea that suddenly I'm going to be a military leader was scary as hell, and I didn't know if I could do it. So that was another sort of element, mitigating against going to officer candidate school. But actually, the thing that probably finally tipped the scales is at some point they gave you a little card, which had pay grades on it, military pay grades, and I looked at the pay grade of an E1, which is a private, and I looked at the pay grade of an O1, which was the lieutenant. Mm-hmm. And I said, all right, well, okay, I'll go to officer candidate school.
Well,
some money in it.
A couple of things. One's an observation, just the thought of somebody with a semester and a half of college and 19 years old being considered, at that point in history, it's pretty amazing. I believe shortly thereafter, after the Vietnam War, that the Army, as well as the other services, had pretty much standardized on having a bachelor's degree to get a commission.
Actually, before that time, I'll tell you, but before that time, I think there was a point before I got in where you had to have at least 2 years of college. Mm-hmm. Okay. But one of the things that happened was they were losing so many junior officers in Vietnam. that they actually lowered the standards, where all you needed was to have graduated from high school and passed this test, which was, I mean, if I remember correctly, it was a bullshit test. It was like this sort of semi-patriotism test. It's like, it was, it was pretty easy to understand what were the answers that they want, with multiple choice. It was pretty easy to understand what the answers were that they wanted. And so, but yeah, I mean, it was pretty crazy to that there's a lot of folks who graduated from officer candidate school who should have never been officers. Perhaps myself among them, although I think I did all right as an officer, but I wasn't a great officer, but I fulfilled my duty, I guess. So
I guess the other question I have, at the age of 19 and a half, and certainly at a minimum through old war movies or through your father's stories or whatever, did you appreciate at the time the difference in status between officer and enlisted?
On some level I did, but I have to say, again, part of it, I really, at that particular time, I can't say that that I focused on that. And again, the reality of the type of training that the military does, where the training of the military is always that when you're in the training situation, you are the lowest thing on earth, and particularly so in officer candidate school. So until really my officer candidate school was 23, infantry officer candidate school was 23 weeks long. Then after your 18th week, you then become a senior candidate, and then you actually start to have some privilege and some status. But, for the first 18 weeks of officer candidate school, you are the absolute lowest thing. I mean, you're a turd. That's what they call you all the time. You're a turd, and you're treated that way. And so all my time up until my 18th week in officer candidate school in the military, I was treated like a piece of shit, so that was my whole experience. So I didn't really know anything about status.
But going back to this decision was made for you pretty much early on during basic training. Did you have to complete basic training or any other training after that before you got to officer candidate school?
Yes, I had to go through basic training. Yeah, in other words, everybody's got to go through basic training. First 8 weeks that you're in the military, and then after basic training, then there's what's called AIT, advanced individual training. So that's where you basically go to whatever the specialty school is, whatever your military specialty is going to be, MOS, military occupation specialty, and you get that. So after basic training, I went to basically infantry MOS. My MOS was infantry. So I went to infantry advanced training up at the Fort in New Jersey. And all of a sudden I'm
Fort Dix,
New Jersey. And then and that was another 8 weeks of training. Basic training, it's primarily getting you in shape and familiarizing you with the standard military weapon, which at that time was the M16. Advanced infantry training. You do a little bit of small unit tactics. And you get training on a number of other weapons, the M60 machine gun, the M79 grenade launcher. You get to fire a 50 caliber machine gun, other types of weapons. And then after the advanced infantry training, then I went to officer candidate school.
Oh, okay. And where was that located?
That's down at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
Which is also, that's the sort of the infantry school for the Army is located at Fort Benning. The airborne school is located there. Also, the Ranger school is located there. So our barracks were like right on a corner, as I remember, and just across the road was the was part of the airborne school, the place where the big towers are that you drop from the second week. So I could just be, just looking at the airborne and hoping. So I went through officer candidate school, 23 weeks. The kind of interesting thing was I originally signed up, my original enlistment was 3 years. And in those days, basically you had a 2-year commitment in the military from the day that you graduated from officer candidate school. They changed that because some people were gaming the system on that. So I ended up graduating from officer candidate school 11 months after I joined the Army. So I actually cut 1 month off of my service time by going to officer candidate school.
Going back to when you first went in the service and had made that decision, I knew that you'd been away to college for at least a semester and a half. Then you were on the road for about a year. So you had some experience of breaking away from your family. But then going into the military itself do you experience any kind of culture shock going to that type of regimentation, or were you pretty comfortable with it? Or
I would say I was comfortable, but I would say that I adapted to it. I didn't have any particular difficulty with it. Again, maybe that's Catholic school and the nuns,
Just speculating, yes.
Yeah, nuns. Nuns certainly have certain drill sergeant.
So all the things like the discipline, the physical regimen, barracks life, well, see the food, social life, all that.
Yeah, I mean I can say the physical stuff was I was in fairly good shape, although not nearly as good shape as I thought I was But when I look at some of the other guys, so the physical regime, which is the big part of the difficulty for a lot of guys initially, because they're not particularly in good shape and they have to get in shape, through the rigors of basic training and all of the physical stuff that they put you through. I was in relatively good shape at the time. I was into sports in high school and everything, and so I didn't have as much getting in shape as a lot of other guys did. So that's the sort of the physical trauma of joining the military was not so hard for me. But I have to say that one of the things I quickly learned was how much more my body could do after my mind said no more. That's one of the things that that sort of the military experience showed me, that that my mind was willing to give up way before my body actually could, because before that nobody really a little bit in sports, but really not a whole lot. Not nearly as much as in the military, but on some long distance run somewhere in the military, and I'm saying I can't go another step, and then 10 miles later it's like, whoa, I'm still going.
Somebody else was making that choice for you, I take
right,
it.
exactly. Exactly.
Do you remember any of the either instructors or your fellow soldiers at that time? Anybody still sticks out that you recall, or is it all just kind of a blur at this point?
Most of the early stuff is from basic training and advanced training. It's pretty much a blur. There's from officer candidate school. It's interesting. There was one guy in the in our company. He ended up not graduating from officer candidate school, and after he dropped out of officer candidate school, he went to to dog school. So he basically was a dog trainer. I forget what they call them, but
handler, I think they call it.
Yeah, dog. Yeah, and and he and I were, we kind of, we in officer candidate school, during the time before he dropped out, he was in a different platoon from we were in a company and he was in a different platoon, and the way things were in those days, you barely knew the guy, you knew the guys in your platoon, but even other guys in your company, that it was everything was very segmented and regimented. But me and a couple of other guys sort of put out some kind of again, we were trying to garner favor, so we ended up coming up with this sort of company newsletter that we put out on a weekly basis, just little interviews. I would interview, one of the what they call TAC officer, the tactical officers, who were the ones who were, in charge of the platoons and stuff like that. But there was one time we had a little space left in the newsletter, and I had this, wasn't very good in retrospect, but it was this poem that I had written. And so we, all right, fine, we'll just put it in there. So then, about a week later, this guy comes up to me. He, a black guy, and from one of the other platoons says, hey, I write poetry too. I liked your poem. And so we sort of struck up a friendship based on that. And, and then we kind of, after I graduated, he was still going to dog handler school there. And, and I was actually stationed at Fort Benning after I graduated from OCS. And, we saw one another a couple of times. Then, we just kind of lost contact as, the way those things happen. And, so years and years later, about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I used to have this thing that I would do at work, when I was bored. I would just Google the name of somebody from my past and just see if I could find him, And he had a relatively unique name, Lamont B. Steptoe. And so I Googled Lamont B. Steptoe, and he was the poet laureate of Pennsylvania.
Wow. I
mean, he's published numerous books of poetry. He received a MacArthur Foundation award, so I did a little more searching, and I found him on Facebook, and I said, hey, so I sent him a message on Facebook. Hey, I don't know if you remember me, but not only did he remembered the freaking poem.
What a great story that is.
That I had written in that stupid, company newsletter. So we've now sort of become friends. We were, he was up to my house last year, and he's, so he's about the only one from that time that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know you started to say earlier that the first, what was it, the first 18 out of 23 weeks, was it, or whatever, that you're treated like dirt or otherwise. And then that last 5 weeks, they're trying to teach you like an officer is going to be, or.
Yeah, you develop a certain style. Before that time, you're not allowed to leave your company area. Then, you start to be able to get overnight passes. There's a senior candidate ball where they, apparently there's this whole group of young women from the local town there who attend all these balls, and so you gotta have a date, and you get to wear these little blue neckerchiefs and whatever, so you sort of begin to get the feeling of what it's like to be an officer, and I got to apply for jump school, and I was accepted. So that was, I was very, very happy. And so I, right after I graduated from officer candidate school, I went to jump school and got my jump wings also. So.
Oh, wow. So 11 months in, you're commissioned, and you're a second lieutenant, and going to your dream training, I guess, at that point.
Yep. And and then after I graduated from jump school, I was assigned to, I I think it was it's either the 197th or the 199th. I always get these two mixed up. Infantry Brigade, which was stationed there at Fort Benning.
Mhm.
And the primary role of this group of soldiers was that they played the bad guys for all of the military exercises that the infantry school down there undertook. And it was not considered a glamorous assignment.
Mhm.
But I went over there, so I reported to the brigade headquarters, and just by pure luck, at the time that I walked through the door, there was one airborne company that was attached to this infantry brigade. It was Company A, 75th Infantry, which was a ranger company, a long-range reconnaissance patrol company. That was attached to the brigade. And just as I happened to walk through the door, they happened to need a second lieutenant platoon leader, and who was airborne qualified. And so I ended up getting into a ranger company.
So, what do we used to call that, line of sight decision making or something? But so, if we could go back just for a second to
Sure.
your airborne training, what was that like, and did you enjoy it?
I did. It was scary as hell. Particularly, I mean, there's basically 3 weeks of jump school. The first week is, I think, called ground week. Where basically you're basically spending your time learning how to land, how to fall. What they call a PLF, parachute landing fall. And then the second week is tower week, where they had these 250-foot tall towers. These were the towers that right across it from where my OCS barracks was. Where it's kind of like the parachute jump at Coney Island. Where it kind of, these cables take you up. Now at Coney Island, the cables stayed connected to the parachute as you came down. But at the jump school, you go, these cables take you up, and then at the 250-foot mark, then the cables release, and then you float down, and so you actually have actually have the feeling of coming down in a parachute and landing. Again, jump school was supposed to be really tough, but frankly, by the time I went to jump school right out of officer candidate school, I was in the best shape of my life. So the physical aspect of jump school, which was supposed to be really tough, it was a breeze for me. In jump school, it's like any little thing you do wrong, it's like drop and do 10 push-ups. Well, by that, push-ups have never been my forte, but by the time I got out of officer candidate school, 10 push-ups, what are you kidding? Ain't no problem here, And then the third week is actually jump week. You have to do 5 jumps to be qualified, and most of the jumps are what they call Hollywood jumps, where you jump with no equipment, just with the parachute, and it wasn't bad, because you basically jump. Okay, you're doing what they call static line, so it's not free fall. So there's a line that's hooked up inside the plane, and it's hooked to the top of the parachute. So you jump out, and then it pulls the parachute out, and then there's a little string that holds it on, and then that spring breaks after the parachute comes out. And I mean, you're inside of the plane. There's no windows in the plane, so you don't have necessarily the sensation of being up in the air. I think we jumped from like 1,250 feet was the height, and if you're in the middle of the stick, so a stick is like the line of men, and you're jumping out of both sides of the airplane. And so I was almost always during jump school, I was almost always in somewhere in the middle of the stick. And so, so there's a guy who's jumping in front of you, and there's a guy behind you kind of pushing you behind, so you don't have any time to even think I'm jumping out of an airplane and I'm 1,250 feet in the air. So you just do it. And it, it was totally exhilarating, to be, hanging in the air and there's all these other crazy guys all around you, all hanging in the air, yelling and screaming at one another. And, and again, the field you land on, it's relatively soft. They keep it soft. The worst thing is that sometimes if the wind, if there was a heavy wind, there was forest down at one end of the field, and so some guys would blow into the forest. And the other thing, if you just practice what you, what they train you for, then it was pretty easy. Because I had, the two things they tell you as far as the parachute landing fall is always keep your legs together, and basically, you're hitting with your toes, and then you're sort of rolling, so you're kind of distributing the force of the fall over various parts of your body. So not one part of the body is not taking the full force of the thing. So they say, keep your feet together and keep your knees flexed. So I had one guy who graduated from Officer Candidate School for me, I think on his second jump, he came in with his legs apart and his knees locked, and he broke both his legs. I sprained my ankle on my third jump. I've had difficult. I sprained my ankle right before I went to basic training. The night before, the last night in the reception center before the next morning we were marching off to Officer Canada to basic training. I got involved in a basketball game, little pickup basketball game, and I sprained my ankle. And I was thinking, oh shit, man, I guess I'm gonna be sitting here at the reception station for a couple of weeks peeling potatoes, while this ankle heals. And so I went on sick call the next morning, and they gave me an ace bandage and told me to get back in line. So I basically went through Officer Candidate School, basic training with a sprained ankle for the first several weeks. And, and then I knew if I told anybody that I had sprained my ankle on my third jump, that I would wash out of, they wouldn't let me jump the last two jumps, and you got to have the 5 jumps to qualify. So I made my last 2 jumps in jump school on a sprained ankle also. Wow. And I now have 40% disability on that ankle because it's totally screwed up. But anyway, so I got through jump school, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. The element of height didn't really affect me that much. That time it did when I went to the Ranger School, because we were on jump status, which also meant that I got the extra money. If you're on jump status, you get extra money per month. And I think in those days, enlisted men got $55 extra a month, and officers got $110 extra a month. The enlisted men in my company would say, why is it more dangerous for officers to jump out of an airplane than enlisted men, or what?
Just like Air Force flight pay in the day. Okay, so you go through OCS at Benning, you get to go to jump school at Benning, and then you wound up in this other training assignment, where you, as I understand correctly, as you started to say, you get to play the role of the bad guys to train people.
And actually, the specific mission of this airborne company that was in this training brigade was to be the bad guys called the. I just lost you. I lost you.
Oh, hold on. I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I just can't see you.
Yeah.
So,
No,
see me.
I bumped into my mouse. Let's see. We'll see if we can get my picture back. But you can keep talking. I'll work on my.
By the way, my picture is labeled Natalia Mahoney.
I see that. That's fine.
Yeah.
I-
But the specific mission of this airborne company was to be the aggressors. That's what the bad guys were called for the Ranger School in at Benning. And so I kind of got to go to Ranger School, but sort of on the other side.
Yeah.
As the bad guys. I applied to go to Ranger School because, again, I wanted to do everything the hardest stuff in the world.
Mhm.
And the Ranger School was considered probably the most difficult military training that there was. The washout rate for Ranger School was phenomenal. Not very many people got through, but if you got through, you got that little Ranger patch on your shoulder, and that was, then you were the man, And so I wanted that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the captain of my Ranger company had actually washed out of Ranger School, so he decided that Ranger School wasn't that important, and so I applied, and he turned down my request.
Okay. How long did that assignment last?
Let's see, maybe 4 or 5 months or something like that.
Mhm.
It was an interesting assignment because, I basically was in charge of a platoon, almost all of whom had already been to Vietnam and back. So again, it was kind of one of those weird situations. I'm this freshly minted second lieutenant who barely knows his ass from his elbow, and I'm in charge of a platoon of all these guys who've already been to war and back. Many, they had Purple Hearts and Silver Stars and
Mhm.
Bronze Stars and everything. Again, that one of the mistakes that many young lieutenants made in those days was they somehow thought that the way that they were treated in officer candidate school is the way that you're supposed to run a platoon. And also many of them knowing that that they didn't know nearly as much as the men that they were supposed to be in charge of, tried to play hard asses, and then to kind of, I'm in charge, or you can't do anything. And, I realized very quickly that, that I couldn't play that role. And so, I pretty much, my approach to my platoon was, look, you guys have been there and done that. I'm going, there's no question that I'm going to go to Vietnam very soon in my future. So if there's anything that you guys can teach me or can help me with, I'd really appreciate it. So I think most of the guys in my platoon sort of appreciated the approach, and we're very helpful, and and I didn't try to lord it over them. Unfortunately for a lot of guys, that many of these guys a number of them were draftees. So draftees had a 2-year commitment. So these were guys who were drafted into the Army, went to basic training, went to, advanced infantry training, and immediately got sent to Vietnam, did their year in Vietnam and came back and still had, 4 to 6 months of military service still left on their 2 years. And so many of these guys I saw, that, one of the things they used to do is if you survived your year in Vietnam, they'd give you sergeant stripes as kind of a reward for surviving for a year and coming home. And so many of these guys I saw came home as E5s, as sergeants, with like 4 or 5 or 6 months left in the military. And by the time they, they finally got out of the military, they were back down to E1.
Wow.
Totally unable to deal with the chicken shit bullshit that is associated with sort of stateside service. And the classic line is, "What are you going to do? Send me to Vietnam?"
But again, that's technically your very first command. Did they recommend, besides what you said, as far as working with these folks, did you find a senior NCO, an old crusty guy, to adopt you as a second?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I had a exactly that type of guy, a platoon sergeant. So every platoon has a platoon sergeant. And I had my crusty platoon sergeant. Again, I relied on him a whole lot, and he was diplomatic. He knew I didn't know my ass from my elbow, so he'd go, sir, I think maybe you ought to do this. Or, sir, don't you think that it would be good if we did things this way? He basically ran the platoon, although I was nominally in charge.
Sure.
And I was the one who sort of gave the orders. He was the one who was telling me what to say, essentially. So,
I don't want to get too far ahead because I know you've hinted that you went to Vietnam eventually, but what you learned in that assignment, do you think that proved helpful as far as being, they brought back lessons learned about being aggressors? Would that have been helpful in the long run when you went to Vietnam, what you learned about, say, the tactics that the North Vietnamese use, that sort of thing?
I think the thing was that, they had all essentially served in, sort of frontline units when they were in Vietnam. Some of them had served in long-range reconnaissance patrol units when they were there, which was a whole very specialized type of work. When I got to Vietnam, I served in a very different type of situation than most of them did. I did not serve in a frontline American unit. I was an advisor when I was there. When Nixon came in '68, and they nominally started this withdrawal of American troops then, and they instituted this program which was called Vietnamization, and the idea being that that as American troops are withdrawn, then more and more of the frontline fighting and whatever would be taken over by the South Vietnamese Army. We used to derogatorily call it changing the color of the corpses. So because of the Vietnamization things, more and more of soldiers who were being sent to Vietnam in 70, 71, 72, which was the time when I was being sent there, were being sent as advisors. So we went from, originally in the early 60s, it was all advisors. Then, in the middle 60s, they moved to the frontline troops through to the end of the 60s. And then at the end of the 60s, when they sort of started the withdrawal process, then, and again, it wasn't like units being withdrawn. Basically what was happening is people would, you went to Vietnam as an individual, you came home as an individual, not as a unit. There was the CBs, a few other things came and went as units, but basically, Vietnam was individuals. You had, a 1-year tour, or if you were a Marine, because they can't count, that you had 13 months. And at the end of that time, you then, rotated out and went home. So one of the ways they sort of withdrew was, as people were normally rotating out, they were simply not replacing them. And those who were being sent over, like me, were then sent over as advisors and were not sent into mainline American units.
So did you, before going there then, and we'll get to the dates and everything, but did you have to go through more specialty training to become an advisor?
Yes, I did. I did have some specialty training. Just one thing that I can say that I did learn from those guys, which was that your primary mission when you're in country in Vietnam is to survive 1 year. Okay, that's what you're there for. That forget about military objectives, forget about winning the war, forget about any kind of thing along those lines. Your objective when you go to Vietnam is to survive 1 year and get home. So that's one lesson that I learned from that. Back to your other question, yes, I did. When I got my orders for Vietnam, first they sent me to. I had to go do 2 trainings prior to actually going there. First was a short, I don't know, 4 to 6 week training or something at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which was, they had an advisor school there. So, they were teaching you how to be an advisor. And establishing rapport with your counterpart, and cultural sensitivity to, because so much of your training up to that point in the military has been, Vietnamese or gooks, and sort of this disparagement of the Vietnamese as a people. And so then, if you're going there as an advisor, you're actually working together with South Vietnamese. So they had to try to change your mindset, which all your other training had been basically geared towards, seeing Vietnamese as less than you, as gooks, as these, people that nobody you can trust. So advisor school is somehow saying, well, actually, you don't really want to think that way, because you have these other guys that they're kind of good guys. Most of them are good guys, and you have to work together with them, and and that type of thing. I'll tell you one funny story, I guess. I don't know, it was kind of embarrassing. So I was one of we went through this advisor school thing at Bragg, and one of the so at the end of the training, they had a graduation ceremony. It was in this kind of auditorium or something, and so they called that. So there were like 2 or 3 outstanding trainees who were recognized at this graduation ceremony. And so when the thing was, if they called your name, you're supposed to come up onto the stage, stand at attention while they read this letter of commendation that would become a permanent part of your military file. So it turns out that I was one of the 3 outstanding people. So the night before, I had gone out drinking with a bunch of my other second lieutenant friends who were also going to this advisor school. And so we hit a bunch of different bars in the Fayetteville area. And we ended up at the, Fort Bragg is a very big airborne fort. And so we ended up and there's a bar there, which is the airborne bar. And so somehow we ended up at the airborne bar, the last bar we hit that night. And I was the only second lieutenant of this group that went out drinking who was airborne qualified. And, and of course I was, I was getting, ribbed the whole night. Only thing that falls out of the skies are airborne and bird shit, and stuff like that. And, so right as we were leaving the bar, I, primarily because we were leaving. So I was just, and I was feeling my oats because I was in the airborne bar. I said, I could freaking chug a pitcher of beer, and just sort of making this stupid boast as we were leaving. Well, of course, one of my friends immediately passed the hat. They bought me a pitcher of beer. So I proceeded to chug it. And I said, okay, let's get out of here, guys. So anyway, so I, the next morning, I'm one of the 3 outstanding students. So I walk up on the stage. I'm standing there at attention. They're reading this letter, and suddenly I just fainted dead away on the stage.
I hate when that happens. Yeah.
And in classic military fashion, they just continued on with the ceremony while I was laying there for about, I don't know, probably less than a minute. It felt like ages, and I was finally able to semi get to my feet and stumble off the stage. So that was my advisor school experience. And then after that, they sent me to the 3 months of language school down at Fort Bliss, Texas, to learn, rudiments of Vietnamese language.
About what time was that, date-wise?
This was early 1970. Early 1970. end of 69, early 70.
Mhm.
There was a major language school out at Monterey, California, which was like the year-long thing where you learned the language. The one down at Fort Bliss was 3 months long. What we always used to say is, we learned enough Vietnamese to get into trouble and not enough to get out of trouble.
Yeah.
But I had 3 months of the language school, had a short leave home, and then I was on my way to Vietnam.
Who were the instructors at the language school?
Language school were basically Vietnamese women who had married American soldiers and come to the United States.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And what was your comfort level with the Vietnamese language by the time you graduated? Yeah.
I knew a lot of military terminology. I could carry on basic conversations, what's your name, where are you from, that kind of stuff. I could probably order food in Vietnamese.
Mm.
But I did not have any, there was no, when I did get to Vietnam, a lot of what I did was training of South Vietnamese soldiers, and I always had to use an interpreter.
Mhm.
I didn't have enough Vietnamese language to be able to do a training by myself.
So the language school was your last formal stop before going to Vietnam?
Yes.
And how did you, when and how did you get to Vietnam?
I guess I got to Vietnam in either late March or early April of 1970. Again, when language school was over, I had a week or 10 days of leave. I went back to my parents' house. By that time, they were living in Massachusetts, and stayed with them for that time. And then I remember they basically put me on a plane. I flew to I guess San Francisco, and reported, and then basically got on the plane for Vietnam in San Francisco. We flew. It wasn't a nonstop flight. We flew to Hawaii. We stopped over for several hours in Hawaii, I guess, while the plane was refueling. We never left the airport. And then from Hawaii, we then flew on to Vietnam.
Is that one of those civilian charters, or was it
Yes.
a cargo plane?
No, it was a civilian charter, yeah. So
Yeah.
it was like being on a commercial plane. Yep.
Okay, so you hit the tarmac in South Vietnam, and you step off the plane. Any initial first impressions?
Two major first impressions. First was heat. I mean, when you say I hit the tarmac, it felt like the tarmac hit me. There was just like this absolute blast of super, super hot air as you came out the door. That was, wow, it's hot here. And the second was smell. It was just obviously, it was just a completely and totally different smell than anything that I had ever smelled before. I had never really left the United States before. This was really my first time out of the United States.
Sure.
So, I've been to a lot of places in my life now, and I realize that every place has their own, kind of distinctive aroma, which is slightly different from what I may have at home. But it was the heat and the smell are the two things that really, hit me as I got off the plane.
And then you had to, I'm guessing you had to go to some form of orientation. And then did you know where you're going to go yet when you got there? Or?
Not really. I was assigned generally to what they call MACV, with Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which was essentially that. So that was the advisor group, the overall advisor group in Vietnam. I don't quite remember So there was, a couple of days of just in country, in processing paperwork kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another relatively short sort of advisor training, in-country advisor training that I went to. I don't even remember where it was, or the only image I have of that I can remember from that time is I remember sitting in some kind of a hovel of an officers club on whatever the base was that this training was taking place, and listening on Armed Forces radio to Willis Reed coming out of the tunnel, the 7th game of the NBA Finals, that the Knicks won the championship.
Yeah, must have been in the like Twilight Zone for you to hear that.
I know, it was unbelievable. I was there. I was like totally in, but it was just that, that brief, and then I listened to the game. The Knicks, blew away the Lakers, essentially without Willis. But it was just like that, that brief feeling of, just of normalcy. I'm just a basketball fan, and the Knicks have finally won the championship kind of thing. But and then suddenly, I'm in the middle of, Vietnam, about to head off into war. I don't quite remember when I got my orders, whether it was at the end of that school, before that school, or whatever. But my orders were basically I was assigned to I Corps, which was so Vietnam was sort of at the 4 core areas, and I Corps was the northernmost area of South Vietnam. So the top of I Corps was the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam, so I was assigned. So I flew from wherever that base was to I'm now spacing on the name of the city that I flew to, but it was one of the main cities in I Corps. And then from there I flew up to Hue City. So Hue is the capital of what's called Thu Tin Province. So province is sort of roughly equivalent to an American state. I flew up to Hue City, and from there I was assigned to something that was called a mobile advisory team, which was a small, supposed to be, basically it was supposed to be a 5-man team. Most of the teams that I worked on never had more than 2 or 3, with maybe an interpreter. And they were assigned to a district. So it was roughly equivalent to a county, okay, within a province. So I was originally assigned. I was the team leader for a mobile advisory team in a district called Phu Tu District, which was to sort of southeast, as I remember, of Hue City, close to Camp Eagle, which was the headquarters for the 101st Airborne at that time. So I was assigned to the district. There was a district team leader who advised the district chief, and basically the district team leader would then had the authority to assign the MAT team to various different responsibilities within the district, depending on what the needs were. So in Phu Tu District, the primary need at that point was for training. How do I, if you listen to my other interviews, I tend to give the long story sometimes. So I'm trying.
That's fine. I was just going to say, in relation to that, if you do need to take a break, I'm able to pause this. But keep going, I can keep going too.
I can keep going too. But let me just try to give a little context to the training that I was doing. So within the South Vietnamese forces, there were several different levels. There were what's called the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, who were basically the main force, kind of the equivalent to, more or less the equivalent to the American main force that are there. So sort of regular army. Then on the province level, they had what were called the RFs and the PFs, the regional forces and the popular forces, nicknamed the Rough Puffs. So they were sort of roughly equivalent to our National Guard or state militias. So they were lower level troops, sort of not. But at that time, as the Vietnamization process that was going on, so the idea was that the ARVN were now taking over some of the main force responsibilities that American forces had undertaken in the past. And before that, the ARVN primarily had sort of local kind of security mission, protecting hamlets and stuff like that. So as the ARVN were sort of moved into the sort of the mainline fighting situation, then these Rough Puffs were more or less moved into these security positions formerly occupied by the ARVN. And again, as part of the overall upgrading of that, before that time, the Rough Puffs had just a motley assortment of, whatever weapons they could kind of find. But at that point in time, the Rough Puffs were being outfitted and equipped with, basically with M16s and the other sort of more modern weapons that the ARVN already had. So in Futu district, there were a bunch of these Rough Puff companies that were sort of scattered around the district. And so the MAT team was then assigned. They had basically all of them had just received fairly recently their allotment of M16 rifles. So our mission, the MAT team that I was working on, our mission was essentially to do weapons training with all of these various Rough Puff units. So we would usually do about a week's worth of training. We'd go into a unit, do all the various training. Last couple of days would be range training, actually, training on firing the weapons. It was very interesting during this time that I was, like I said, I was doing all of my training through an interpreter. So I would give the various training on, this on the weapon and whatever, and how to sight it and, various other things. And then he would translate. And then, because we were doing this over and over again. So I started to vary my delivery a little bit just to make it more interesting for myself. And one of the things I realized is that, I understood enough Vietnamese, listening to my interpreter said exactly the same thing. And then I realized I wasn't giving the class. He was giving the class. I was just a prop.
It was all protocol, huh?
Right. I was just a prop for him to give the class, Yeah. But anyway, so we would, we'd do the weapons training and, and then, the last day or two, then we'd have, actually training on firing the weapons. And the last day, one of the things we always did was we would have a competition. For whatever reason, I didn't really grow up with weapons, but I was a good shot. I was an expert with the M16, and and I could shoot very well. And so we would have a competition where we would have them choose their best, the guy who they thought was their best shooter. And we would have and he would face off against me. And if their guy could beat me, mm-hmm. then we'd give that platoon or whatever, would give them a case of beer. Okay. So I always won, except once. There was one time this young kid, just like this happy-go-lucky kid, farm boy or something, and he beat me, and man, he was like, oh man, So we dutifully handed over the case of beer that we always had in the in our Jeep, and he was like the boys in his platoon were like he was gold. So then a few weeks later, we were driving to another to do another training. We were driving down the road, and we heard an explosion, maybe a few hundred meters across the rice paddies in like a little copse of bamboo or something over there. So we, I forget how I think we got a radio message or something that we should check it out. So we went across the rice paddies, and it turns out that there was this group that we had trained were out on a mission, and one of the guys had stepped on a bouncing Betty mine. And I don't know if a bouncing Betty, it's basically a mine that's spring loaded in the ground. And so then when you step on it and then you step off it, then it jumps up in the air maybe about 2 or 3 feet before it explodes. And it was this guy who had beat me in the rifle competition, was the one who had stepped on the mine. And he died. He was still alive when we first got there, but he died soon after. It's interesting because either he or somebody or one of his mates was that there was this kind of French cigarette. I think it's called Gauloise cigarettes. They came in these very light blue cigarette packages. A lot of the Vietnamese smoked them. They were quite prevalent in South Vietnam, and somebody was smoking. Either he had been smoking it or somebody was smoking it at that time. And it's a cigarette with a very distinctive smell. It's specialized Turkish tobacco, and well, luckily that that those cigarettes are not particularly prevalent in the United States, but for me, the smell of the Gauloise cigarette is the smell of death. And I remember when I went to France, and I would smell these cigarettes, and it immediately brought me back to that scene of that that little young kid, just laying on the ground with half his body blown out. So,
a couple of questions of your time there. I know you were advising. Did you have regular encounters with adversaries, or were they rare?
They were relatively rare. Okay, first of all, I worked at that time in the war in 1971. Most of the mainline fighting was happening out in the highlands, out in the sort of to the west of South Vietnam. So generally the way it is, the eastern portion is flat. This is where all the rice paddies are. This is where the majority of the population is. It's right. It's sort of the sea, and then there's the sort of the flat land where the rice paddies are, and then it goes out into the to the mountains. So most of the mainline fighting, the back and forth kind of fighting, was happening out in the mountains. There was very little, at least in the area that I worked, that was happening in the lowlands. But what was happening in the lowlands was much more of a dirty war, much more of a one-sided war. Essentially, the area that I worked in was heavily booby-trapped. Okay, the second place that I worked, about halfway through my tour, I was transferred to a different mobile advisory team in a different district, Phong Dien district. which is the northernmost district in Tuatin province, right, bordering right on Quang Tri province, which is the northernmost province in South Vietnam. And this was this area was very heavily booby trapped. There was an area in Phong Dien district called that had received the nickname during the French War of the Street Without Joy. And actually Bernard Fall, who was a journalist, wrote a book by that name specifically about this area, which was extremely heavily booby trapped. So essentially the war that I fought was, they booby trapped us, and we very rarely would catch them in an ambush. In the area that I worked in, Phong Dien district, it was right on a river that came out from the highlands and flowed towards the sea. And the hamlets along that river, most of the major NLF cadre for Phong Dien or for Tuatin province came from those hamlets. So they were very friendly to the enemy. So they were a primary resupply area for it. So that the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, were fighting out in the highlands. But by that time in the war, most of the South Vietnamese, the NLF or BC battalions had pretty much been dissipated as a result of Tet and other things. So that there weren't a lot of main force mainline Southern forces among the enemy. So almost all the fighting was being done by the North Vietnamese. And so the North Vietnamese would then send couriers into the lowlands. They would hook up with VC cadre in the lowlands, and who would then bring them in to the villages to get resupply that they would then bring back out to the main forces in the mountains. And so we did manage to catch one of these resupply missions in an ambush. It was pure luck. I mean, the Vietnamese didn't like to, the basic idea of an ambush is you go out, almost all ambushes were night ambushes, and you go out and stay out all night. Well, the Vietnamese didn't like to stay out all night. So usually about midnight or 1 o'clock, one of the South Vietnamese soldiers would shoot off a couple of rounds, and it's like, oh, well, the ambush is compromised. I guess we got to go home. So I was out on this ambush. I was the only American out. You weren't supposed to do, but when I was transferred to this other team, the first team that I was on, I was the team leader, and the second team that I was transferred to, there was a captain there who was the team leader. So I was like the deputy team leader, and I didn't get along with the captain at all. He was regular Army. He was very disappointed and disillusioned, because he was he wanted to make the military a career. He was a captain. He thought as a captain he should be a company commander. That was the next thing that he needed in his career path in the military. And they had put him on this mobile advisor team. Well, he hated it. He hated it, and he took it out on me. So well, and so anytime I could get away from him, I would do anything I could to get away from him. And so I would be willing to go out on these night ambushes with the Vietnamese, which you weren't supposed to do, just primarily as a way to just so I didn't have to be around him. So anyway, there was this. We were out on an ambush. Typical. What happened was, one of the guys, 12 or 1 o'clock at night, one of the guys shot off a couple of rounds, and so we were all heading back, heading in from the ambush, and we just happened to. These three guys were walking out of the village as we were kind of walking in, and So two of them, we were able to kill two of them, and the third one got away. One of the ones who was killed was one of the major BC cadre for that area that they have been trying to find for a long time. It was purely luck. And, the funny thing is that, so as sort of a reward, the Americans decided they started giving out medals left and right to all the South Vietnamese, as an encouragement. See, hey, was getting these guys to run any kind of military operations was not, was very difficult. I usually had to use bribery in order to get them to even run a military operation. So the South Vietnamese felt obliged to reciprocate. So I got a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry awarded to me by the South Vietnamese Army for this little pseudo ambush or whatever it was, this meeting in the road, this accidental meeting in the road. So there was.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. One other story that I always want to tell, because it's a story that I can say when I went to, I made a conscious decision. By the time I was ready to go to Vietnam, I pretty much knew. I was a product of my generation. I just knew that this war was totally wrong. We shouldn't be there. We needed to get out. We weren't doing anybody any good by being there. But then I also made a conscious decision of, well, I'm a soldier. And so whatever anti-war feelings I may have during the time that I'm in Vietnam, I'm going to put those aside and I'm going to do my duty. And I'll worry about those types of things if and when I get back. But there were all kinds of things that were happening during the course of my tour that were just contributing more and more to my recognition that this was really, at least at that time, I thought a big mistake, as opposed to saying that it was a conscious element of U.S. foreign policy. But anyway, so we ended up getting another training mission when I was on the second team in Phong Dien District. So they had this other thing that they had created, this other entity called the PSDF, the People's Self-Defense Forces. And these were basically civilians who the South Vietnamese government, basically that motley assortment of old weapons that the Rough Huff used to have. When they got their M16s, they basically handed these weapons out to these local civilians in the hamlets. And these People's Self-Defense Forces were supposed to be sort of, again, self-defense forces to protect their hamlets from BC infiltration. So they created a group of about 29 of these PSDF out of these three hamlets that was strung along this river that we were assigned to, and we had a job to then train them in the use of the weapons that they had and in sort of basic rudimentary small unit tactics. So we put them through about a 3-week training course, and then at the end of the training course, then the province chief, who was like the big like the governor, sort of came down. There was this big graduation ceremony, and they gave everybody these little colorful neckerchiefs, PSDF and everything, and great. And then I don't know, a few weeks later, some VC cadre came into the village, gave a little speech, and all 29 they were basically teenagers, walked off and joined the VC, taking all their weapons with them. And, one of the things that, the official report was that they were kidnapped, but they weren't kidnapped. They voluntarily walked off and joined. And again, one of the things that, I'm thinking, because I kind of got to know a couple of these kids, joking around with them during the training and stuff, and then I figured, these kids, they're totally aware of the hurt that the American military can put on their enemies, and they voluntarily decided that they were going to be my enemy. And if that's how they thought, then, my thought was, well, who am I to tell them differently? So that was, again, part of the beginning of my, I wouldn't say my change, but my hardening of my position in terms of just understanding that this war was totally wrong, and that I needed to do something to try to get us out of there.
And you mentioned the word bribe earlier, I think, in context of working with some of the people that you were advising. What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, okay. So I was this was during the time when I was with this second team. So we basically, so there was a rough puff battalion. So there were 3 companies, and that my team was assigned to advise. So there was a battalion commander, and the company, and the primary responsibility of this battalion was so our team house and the battalion headquarters were right on Route 1, which was a major north-south road between Hue and Quang Tri City, and right where. And over this river that I was talking about, there was a bridge called the Onlo Bridge, and the primary role of this battalion was to protect that bridge. And like a few hundred meters upstream was the old Onlo Bridge, which had been blown up during Tet of '68, and then this new bridge had been built by American Seabees. And so we had this nice reminder right upstream of what would happen if we didn't do our job. So this captain who was he was having a lot of family troubles. I don't quite know everything that was happening, but
The captain you were working for.
Yeah,
the American captain. Okay.
The American captain. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So he actually was gone for long periods of 2 or 3 weeks at a time, where he would fly home and have to deal with something or other. So he wasn't around for several large chunks of time. And so, I was in charge, and, so I would always go, I was trying to, do my advisor lessons, establish rapport with my counterparts. So I would try to have meals with the battalion commander and have drinks and, do a little, small talk in the evening kind of stuff. And, and he did not want to run any aggressive military operations. His favorite military operation was what we used to call the search and avoid mission, where he would, if you could get him to run a military operation, he would try to run it in an area where he was pretty much sure that he would not run into the enemy. So I mean, I was, I remember one night we were having some drinks, and and I was trying to, and I was saying, what's wrong with you guys? I mean, this is your country. Why won't you fight for? Here we are. We're Americans. We're over here. Look at all we're doing, and it's not even our country. And his response was, you Americans, he said, you come here for a year and then you go home. You guys always want me to win the war in your year. He said, I am home. I can't get away from the war. I can't, there's no place that I can go to get away from this. I have to make the best of the situation that I'm in, and, he said one time something to the effect of, the Americans are like oak trees. Oh, he didn't say oak trees. I forget what, some type of tree similar to an oak tree. Oak trees are strong, but And when the wind blows, the oak tree will stand against the wind because it's strong. The problem is that if the wind is stronger, then ultimately the oak tree will break. And he said, Vietnamese are like grass. Grass bend with the wind. Whichever way the wind blows, that's the way the grass bends. And then when the wind stops blowing, grass stands back up. Grass never breaks. So
you saw it as kind of a metaphor for the whole situation over there?
Yeah, but so anyway, so he had, the battalion commander had this super shiny Jeep. This was his prized possession, a Jeep. He had soldiers out there every day, like washing it and shining it up and everything. And the South Vietnamese supply system was extremely rigid because it was extremely corrupt. And so you literally had to prove that you had fired a bullet in combat in order to get a bullet to replace it. And he couldn't get spare parts for his Jeep worth of shit through the South Vietnamese supply system. He just couldn't get it. So I kind of figured that out. And the American situation was so loose and easy. We get anything we want. And so I could go over to Camp Eagle, with, what I would do is the Seabees had the best food. Okay. So I would go to the Seabees, I would trade them, some kind of a trophy rifle, an SKS or an AK-47, and they would give me a box of steaks. I would then take the box of steaks to the motor pool over at Camp Eagle, and I would trade the box of steaks for whatever parts I needed for the battalion commander's Jeep. And then I would go to him and say, okay, if I have these parts that you need. Now, if you'll run a decent military operation, you can probably get these parts. So that's what I meant by bribing. So I would basically get him parts for his Jeep in return for him running a military operation. Like I said, we basically worked in a very heavily booby-trapped area. And so our military operations almost always would consist of, he would choose an area where he was pretty sure there wouldn't be any enemy soldiers. And then he would just walk, we would just kind of walk around the area until one of his soldiers had stepped on a booby trap. Then I would call in a medevac, the soldier out, and then we would go home. So those were the military operations that we did.
So as far as going through this bartering system as well, I two questions for you. One, was that pretty much common throughout Vietnam when you were there, throughout? And is that something you just had to learn on the fly? Just techniques that you picked up once you got there and learned from others?
Yeah, well, several things. It's I learned the sort of the much of the techniques from the interpreter that I had on my first advisory team. He knew every trick in the book, and he taught me a lot of them, primarily because by his teaching me, then I was able to get things that he couldn't get that he could then make money on. So there were sort of three major barter pieces or things that you could make money on the black market. Cases of beer, cartons of cigarettes, and what we call greenbacks. All right, let me go through each three. So cases of beer. So every American soldier in Vietnam had what they called a ration card, and it's a little card, and so you were allowed in each month, each individual soldier was allowed to buy 3 cases of beer or 6 cartons of cigarettes. So part of the system was, figuring out how to get around, to be able to, and at each time you would get one, then they would sort of punch off on this little card, on this little ration card. So one of the tricks was that my interpreter taught me was, ways that you could, buy these things, and they were, and you could make money on these things on the black market. And so how do you get these things without having your ration card punched? Well, I found the easy way for the beer. I made friends with, so there was a PX at Camp Eagle, and there was a beer yard there, where they sold the beer. And I just made friends with a couple of the enlisted guys in the beer yard. And they would let me come in and load up the back of my Jeep with as many cartons of cases of beer as I wanted. So there was that, and then there was those could be sold, cigarettes and beer, particularly beer that was in aluminum cans, because it wasn't so much the beer that they wanted, it was the aluminum. That you could get, usually double your money on the black market. Then there was Greenbacks, which was basic American money. So supposedly, in order to not distort the economy of South Vietnam, Greenbacks were illegal in country. So when you came in country, you basically turned in all of your regular American money, and you got what was called MPC, military payment certificates, which is basically like monopoly money, and then, and that's the money that you then used in country. You paid at the PX or whatever. And of course, it was illegal for Vietnamese to have MPC, but of course they all had it. And so because all the Vietnamese had MPC, periodically what they would do is they would just change all of the bills, have new colors, new whatever. And then you would have X amount of time to take your old MPC and change for the new one. And of course, Vietnamese couldn't do that. And any American who might, try to come in with massive amounts of MPC would be looked on with some suspicion. But, so again, some guys were able to do it. And it was a money-making deal, because the Vietnamese who got caught with the old MPC, they had to sell it for like pennies on the dollar to try to get something in return. And so there were a lot of Americans who were making a lot of money on these MPC changes, simply by buying up all of the Vietnamese MPC. But Greenbacks, if you had American money, you could get double your money. If you had $200 in Greenbacks, you could get $400 in MPC. So again, all of this was to not distort the Vietnamese economy, and of course we distorted it even more as a result of doing all of these things. So I used to use MPC. I'd buy a money order for $200, send it home to my brother. My brother would get $200 bills, put them in an envelope, send them to me in Vietnam. Then I would have $200, and I could trade it on the black market for 400 MPC.
Wow. So mail back and forth between home and where you were, that was not an issue, pretty much?
No, I mean, it took a long time, but the mail was not, the stuff that my brother sent me, I only did that 3 or 4 times, I think. But the envelopes were never opened. So the other thing I wanted to say is, as far as this bartering stuff, which is that at the time that I was there, which was, most of 1970 and the early part of 71, again, it was the Vietnamization thing. And there were a lot of, again, there weren't, American units that were rotating out, but there were American units that were essentially being decommissioned, because they would slowly, not replace soldiers. And then when it reached a certain breaking point, whatever soldiers were left there would be assigned to other units, and then that unit would be decommissioned. Okay. The result of that was that there were massive amounts of equipment, because, it's not like, like the unit upped and went some other place. It's just like all the people, were taken out, but all of the unit's equipment was still there. So there were these massive yards full of equipment that, that had been left behind when these units were decommissioned. So it was, it was a gold mine for, and I mean, we had, the second MAT team that I was on, it had just been formed. We basically moved into this, what was a bombed out schoolhouse on the edge of this river. It was basically four walls. It didn't even have a roof at that time when we first moved in, and through scrounging, we got a roof on the place. We got a bunker built outside of it. We got beds. We got a water tower. We got electricity. We got all of this stuff, basically by scrounging, and because there was just all of this stuff around. I mean, for example, me and the captain, we went into this this yard on Camp Eagle. We had this little, we had our Jeep, and we saw, it was just like all of this equipment that had been left behind. And we saw this big trailer, it was basically a trailer that was supposed to go on the back of a deuce and a half truck with two massive generators on it, and so we went into the yard and there was like this little Spec 4, enlisted guy who was in charge of the yard. And we said, we have the permission to take those two generators over there. And he said, oh, well, I have there's this paperwork that you have to fill out. So we filled out the paper. He said, but it needs to be signed by this captain here in order. And, okay, fine. We'll get it signed on the way out. He didn't care. So we hooked up this massive, the trailer with the two generators was probably bigger than our Jeep, but we somehow hooked it onto the back of our Jeep and we just drove out of the yard. And nobody said anything. The only thing that we had, I remember we were driving down the road and this Vietnamese, we stopped at someplace where we had to stop, and this Vietnamese guy, pulled up in a Jeep next to us and looked over at us and just kind of nodded his head yes, and understood what we were doing. So,
addressing some of those more informal aspects of your tour there, a couple of things I'll just kind of jumble together. Were you able to get much time off? And if so, what did you do? And did you socialize at all with the Vietnamese people other than the people you were directly working with?
Sorry, I did the same thing you did, which is I just.
Your picture and voice are still there, and you're moving, so that's good.
Okay, fine. Yeah. Well, I thought I lost the Zoom there for a second. Yeah. On the first MAT team that I was on, most of the trainings that we did were, we would go out early in the morning. And most of the trainings were usually done by about noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we would, most days perhaps, we would then drive into Hue City to the main advisor compound in Hue City. We would shop, get food. There were, and see, there were bars there, clubs there. There was a massage parlor there. So, we usually we would do our work in the mornings and early afternoons, and then we would hang out in the evening, in the late afternoons and evenings at the main thing. So I ended up with a girlfriend from the massage parlor. So I hung out there a lot. Then, apparently somebody complained about the fact that it seemed that we seemed to be in Hue City more than we were in Futu District. So that, we kind of, we had to be more circumspect about how many times we came into the city. When I got to my second team, again, more to sort of get away from having to hang around with the captain all the time. So one of the enterprising little Vietnamese in one of the hamlets close by had sort of set up a little sort of game room in the back of his. He had like a shop where he sold various different things, and then in the back he had a room. He set up a ping pong table there, and sold beer. And so a lot of the South Vietnamese soldiers who weren't on duty would hang out there and play ping pong and drink beer. And so I found out about it, and so I started hanging out there with them, playing ping pong and trying out as best I could my Vietnamese language. So when it came time for my R&R, so there's various different R&R destinations that you could go to. The most popular ones were probably Thailand and Hong Kong. And I think you could also go to Australia. Guys who were married, I think, had the possibility to meet their wives in Hawaii, so they could actually take an R&R in Hawaii and meet their wife there. Well, my girlfriend from the massage parlor in Hue, apparently she was relatively young. I think she was either 17 or 18, and she had sort of run away from home. When her parents found out where she was, I guess she contacted them, but they demanded that she come home. So she left, and she actually lived in Saigon. So I applied for my R&R. I guess it was, I don't know, I forget where I was going. But it didn't make any difference to me because I had no intention of leaving the country. So I basically, because all the R&R flights flew out of Saigon. So I flew down to Saigon, and then rather than getting on the flight, I just went to my girlfriend's house and stayed with her for my R&R.
Hmm.
So I mean, that's...
You met the family, I take it.
Yes, I met the family. They met me. I mean, it's, there was a time when I thought, when I was in country, when I thought that it was something serious. Mm-hmm. I made all these promises about how, I was going to come back and we were going to get married and everything. And of course, as soon as I left country, and, it was an alternative reality there. And, as soon as I left country, then that reality ceased to exist for me. I mean, we exchanged a couple of letters after I got back, but, which I still have somewhere. I have an album. There was one Sunday we went with her family to the Saigon Zoo, and she had a brother who had just bought a new camera, and so he was taking all these pictures of everybody at the Saigon Zoo. So I had this whole picture album of me and her family at the Saigon Zoo one Sunday afternoon, and I have a couple of letters that she sent to me after I got back from Vietnam. But ultimately, I just stopped writing to her.
I would like to move on, if we could, unless you need to add some things about Vietnam specifically, move on to your leaving Vietnam. I first want to ask you if you need a break or you keep going.
I think it's better to keep, if you need a break, that's fine, but
I'm fine. I'll let you know.
All right. Then let's just keep going.
So, when did your tour end and how did you get back to the States? You could give me a little bit about that narrative.
Sure. My tour ended in, I believe I spent 11 months and 22 days in Vietnam. So I got back to the States in early March of 1970. So I had, technically I had maybe another month or so before my official discharge date.
Mm-hmm.
But they basically just discharged me. I basically flew home from Vietnam, got off the plane in San Francisco, and they discharged me right there and then. So literally probably it was maybe 72 hours from the time I left Vietnam till the time I was a civilian on the streets of San Francisco.
And did you fly? I mean, did you fly commercially or on a C-141 or
it was as I remember, it was some kind of a commercial flight. I just remember, because I remember, I remember everybody cheering as the plane took off from the airport in Vietnam, and apparently we weren't the first group that had ever done that, because there were I remember there were stewardesses, and they just were sort of, that's what everybody does.
So you land at Travis Air Force Base, or
I guess it was Travis, and
right outside San Francisco? Yeah,
right outside San Francisco, right? And there was some sort of so there was several hours of sort of paperwork, whatever. But they basically handed me my discharge, and I just walked out.
Wow.
And I know it was it was a shock.
Did you just go to San Fran Airport and fly?
I took a taxi to San Francisco Airport. I think that there may have been one or two other guys who were getting out at the same time as I did. I got there and got on the first flight heading back to Massachusetts, because I didn't have any other place to go. So I was going to my parents' house.
Mm-hmm.
I gave a call to my parents, told them this is the flight that I'm going to be on. And I almost missed it, as I remember. Somehow I got the time wrong, but I just remember running up there. They had literally they had already closed the door of the plane, and I came running up. And they actually opened the door, which they almost never do. They opened the door of the plane for me and let me get on.
So you land in Boston X hours later. Was there any sort of culture shock kicking in at that point, or in the weeks afterwards, or?
Yeah, well, the weeks afterwards for sure. I just remember, the whole family came out to meet me at the airport. When I got off the plane, and it just felt really weird, because I felt that I was playing this role, the sort of returning military hero kind of thing. And I didn't feel anything like that, but I felt that was the role that they expected me to play. Mm-hmm. And, so I played it, and I felt bad because I felt bad because I didn't want to encourage any of my younger brothers to, I didn't want them to feel, oh, military guy, hey, maybe I'll join. Look what he got, man. I didn't want to be encouraging in any way to encourage any of them to think that the military was a good option.
At that point, or at least shortly thereafter, where you're able to candidly share those feelings with your brothers?
Not shortly thereafter. So my brother Henry, who I was closest to, he was, when we were teenagers, he was the musician. I was the athlete. Okay. So he got into music, and also being competitive, like I wanted to get into music too. So we were actually in a rock and roll band together when we were teenagers in high school. Of course, he was the lead guitar, lead singer, lead everything. And, and I played the bass guitar. I mean, I didn't, I was like a monkey, he would show me, okay, for this song, you play this. I didn't know music, but I could play, what I needed for each song and do a little, backup singing, shake it up, baby, kind of stuff. But by that time, he was in a band at that point. Actually, it was he was going to Berklee School of Music in Boston.
Yes, I know. Yes.
Yeah, and he was in this little sort of lounge trio, that were getting bar gigs and ski resort gigs and stuff like that. And so, I was just sort of following him around to his gigs. He was very pleased to realize that I smoked pot. Because when we were younger, I was very much of a straight arrow, and I don't do drugs, and then so he thought it was pretty cool that his straight arrow older brother just got out of the military, he could smoke marijuana with him. So I would be a little bit looser and talk a little bit more with him about things. But my younger brothers, I barely talked to them. And,
so there were a few years younger, I take it.
Yes.
This is when now, sometime in 71?
Yeah, early 71. Yeah.
Early 71. So
March.
I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. I actually have the draft numbers for those years. And I know by December 69, they had that first lottery and the college deferments went away. By 71, they were actually drafting fewer and fewer people.
My brother Henry actually had a one of those years. Now again, I thought it was before they dropped the student deferment, because that they started the lottery before they dropped the student deferment. Because somehow I remember the story being that. My brother Henry got a very high lottery number. And so for that year, he dropped his student deferment because he didn't expect he would be there. So that he was able to, kind of skate through with the high lottery number, knowing that he wasn't going to get drafted.
I know some of this because I went through something similar during the same period of time. And I think they would at least grandfather you. In other words, the lottery was in December of 69, the first lottery. Then they had it annually for a couple of years in December. But you could finish out, for instance, the school year. As an example. So perhaps it was something like that. But again, what town were you and your parents living in, and how long did you hang around there?
They were at that time. They were living in a town called Mansfield, Massachusetts. When they first moved away from Long Island. They weren't able to sell the house that we had on Long Island quickly. So we ended up having to, when we first moved for my father's job, we had to rent for the first year that we lived up there. So we rented in Rhode Island. That was my senior year in high school. But then by the time, I came back from the military, they had finally sold the house on Long Island. And they bought a house in Mansfield, Massachusetts. So I was okay. I had, one of the reasons that I left, I didn't mention this before, but my mother was a very, the word that comes to mind is overbearing. But I don't think that's not really fair to her. But she cared deeply about her children, and she wanted to make sure that they did everything the right way. And so sort of the result of that is that she tended to want to make all of our decisions for us. Because she figured that she knew, what was best. Maybe she did, I don't know. So that was one of the things that, and I played that game, for a very long time. I did exactly what she almost didn't have to tell me what to do because I knew what she wanted me to do, and that's what I did. But then when I did that sort of run away from home thing, part of that was a rebellion against that being told what to do. And so here I was. I mean, I hadn't been living at home for probably 4 years already. I'd been in the military, I'd been to Vietnam, I've been back, and now I'm back in my parents' house. And my mother couldn't really get out of, I was still her son, who she needed to tell what to do. And that got old real quick. Originally I had this idea that I was, maybe I would stay around their house for a while and would go to, get back into college somewhere up there. But after very few weeks, I just realized that that wasn't going to work out at all. Mm-hmm. And so two things sort of happened simultaneously. I decided, I just needed to get away. And so I decided I was going to go on a road trip back down to New Orleans, look up some old friends, maybe look up an old girlfriend, who had broken up with me right before I left for Vietnam. And, and I always thought that she broke up with me because she didn't want to have to deal with the anxiety of being my girlfriend while I was there. So I was thinking, well, maybe I'll look her up and see if, maybe we can rekindle something. It didn't happen, parenthetically. So I was just, and I wanted to, kind of get out from under, from being in my parents' house, and the sort of stifling effect that I was feeling of that, so I was, I was going to take this road trip. Originally, it was just going to be a road trip to New Orleans and stay down there for a little while and then come on back. But the second thing that was happening was in April of 1971 was when the Organization of Vietnam Veterans Against the War had their big demonstration in Washington, D.C. This was the demonstration where John Kerry became a national figure as a leader of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And on the last day of the demonstration, the veterans threw their medals back as a protest against the war. So as I was sort of preparing for this road trip to New Orleans, suddenly all of these images are flashing, big time on the nightly news. And again, because Kerry was one of the principal sort of media stars of that whole Dewey Canyon Free, so the VVAW was not only on the national news, but they had like 20 or 25 minutes on the local news up in Massachusetts, because Kerry was from Massachusetts, and so it was very intriguing to me. My father was very, working class, blue collar, patriotic, vote Republican most of his life, and supported Nixon at the time, and was sort of watching the news and cursing at the television, oh, these guys aren't veterans, and I said, well, I think they are veterans, and I think what they're doing is good, and that kind of took him by surprise, because he just assumed that having just returned from Vietnam, that I share all of his sort of blue collar patriotic feelings about things. So it turned out. So I right at the time that I was planning to take my road trip was when VVAW was having this demonstration. So I started driving south, and I actually drove through Washington, D.C. I guess it was the second night or the third night of the demonstration. The night before they threw their medals. The next day they threw the medals, and and I actually sort of drove around DC. I sort of drove past the mall where they were all camping a couple of times, and was kind of looking over to see it. And but I just couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to stop and go over and and kind of join up. Although there was a part of me that wanted to do that, but it was just. I mean, I was barely back from Vietnam, just a little over a month, maybe 2 months or something, and it was just too soon for me. So. I drove around a little bit thinking, should I go? Should I not go? And then I finally just got on the road and headed south for New Orleans like I, had planned to do. Mm-hmm. And, so I went to New Orleans, and I don't know, I just decided that I didn't want to, well, two things. Number one of the things that kept me going while I was in the military was the only real plan that I had, if and when I got out of military, was I wanted to be a hippie. Okay, I felt like I admit there was this whole, lifestyle thing that my generation had gone through and looked incredible. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It looked great from afar, and I felt like I missed out on the whole thing, the whole Woodstock, Hyde-Ashbury, all that stuff that my generation was going through. Well, all of those folks were going through that. I was, going through jump school, and so I wanted to be, I wanted to be a hippie, and I wanted to somehow catch up on all of these experiences that I had somehow missed out on as a result of joining the military. So I didn't want to be at my parents. I knew that living at my parents' house was not gonna work for me. So I had I looked up some people down in New Orleans, looked up the old girlfriend. She didn't really want to have anything to do with me. But I just felt more comfortable down in New Orleans than I did, so I ended up, I enrolled at college at Louisiana State University, New Orleans, LSUNO. I think they call it UNO now. And I bought a Volkswagen van, which of course was the vehicle of choice for hippies. I had a little sports car that was left over from when I was in the military, which I had driven down to New Orleans. And one of my friends down there had a brother who had a Volkswagen van, who was selling it. So I bought the Volkswagen van, drove the sports car back up to Massachusetts, let my brother have it, my brother Henry have it, and then I hitchhiked back down to New Orleans, and then I basically lived in the back of the van for the Volkswagen van. I painted it all kinds of psychedelic colors and everything. Lived there, until I guess August. There was the other thing I wanted to do, part of the hippie experience. So Volkswagen van, okay, check. Was Woodstock. So it turned out that there was some kind of a rock and roll festival that was supposedly happening in somewhere in rural Louisiana that year, the Festival of Life or something like that. It was a total disaster, but I went to it, and so I got my Woodstock experience. I remember it was because everybody was it was on the Atchafalaya River somewhere. And so everybody, and it was horrible weather. It was like blisteringly hot, totally humid, mosquitoes all over the place. And so of course everybody, went down to the river and got naked and jumped in the water, and so this was great. Oh man, hey, we're all naked, because I had a real hard time, literally. Sort of dealing with my constant erection, which everybody in the world could see since I didn't have any clothes on, but I wasn't used to being around females with no clothes on without getting an erection. So that was a kind of difficult but interesting period. Anyway, so I went, and by the end of the summer, I figured, well, if I'm going to college, I can't be living in the back of a Volkswagen van. So I ended up getting an apartment down in the French Quarter. Again, another sort of check off the bucket list, lived down in the French Quarter, and started going to school. And a couple of weeks into the first semester there, I happened to see on the bulletin board, I saw this little leaflet saying, meeting of Vietnam veterans against the war chapter. They were trying to form a chapter on the LSUNO campus. So it gave a time and place. And so, I said, okay, hey, here we go. There were two things going on for me, at the time. Number one, anti-war experience. I wanted to have, get an anti-war experience. And I'm figuring, Vietnam Veterans Against the War was the place where I should do that. And the other thing was quite frankly, I was very uncomfortable. I mean, I was a freshman in college. The overwhelming majority of my classmates were these kids who had just graduated from high school, didn't know their ass from their elbow about anything, except, where's the next party, and here, and I was older than them. I'd been in the military, I'd been to Vietnam. I was in such a totally different place from where I didn't feel any connection at all with any of my classmates. And so another big reason for wanting to join Vietnam Veterans Against the War is because I wanted to be around other Vietnam veterans, because I didn't feel comfortable around people who hadn't been to Vietnam, who hadn't been in the military, hadn't been to Vietnam. So I went to the appointed time and place, and it was a room full of guys. There was a guy, Don Donner, who identified himself as the regional coordinator for Arkansas. And he had basically come down from Arkansas for a few weeks trying to, get some DBAW activity started down in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And so he said that we were going to, the plan was that we were going to march as a chapter in the New Orleans Veterans Day Parade. And of course there had been a call from the local, bona fide from the sort of the standard veterans groups, American Legion, VFW, all bona fide veterans groups are invited to join the Veterans Day Parade. Hey, DBAW, bona fide veterans group, we're going to march. Well, of course, American Legion and VFW types did not really like that. It really didn't want us to march. They got some lawyers involved. And so finally, reluctantly, the traditional veterans group said, okay, they said, come down on the night of the parade. The parade was at night, and to this particular place. And I wasn't involved in any of the negotiations, so I don't know whether they specifically said you will be in the parade. They just said, okay, fine, come down and to this place at this time. So I think 33 of us showed up at the time and place, and we're standing there, and the parade is coming by us. All of these, traditional veterans groups in their, cunt caps and everything, and banners and high school bands and everything, and they're just going by and going by and going by. And then finally we said, well, when do we get to march? And that's when they sprang it on us that, no, sorry, you're not going to be able to march tonight. Of course, the Grand Marshal of the parade was Congressman F. Edward Hebert, who was a Louisiana congressman, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in Congress, in the House. And he had told them very explicitly that he did not want any anti-war groups in his parade. So they said, if you guys march anywhere as a group tonight, you're going to get arrested. So we basically said, fuck it. So we marched and we got arrested. So the first time in my life I was ever arrested was trying to march in my first Veterans Day parade back from Vietnam. So
just to interject one quick question, we can move on from there. When you went back to school, were you able to get GI Bill funding?
Yeah, I did. I mean, that was a part of the motivation. I had saved some money when I was in Vietnam, but I thought I had a lot of money, but you come back to this country and you're not working, it dissipates real quickly. So by August, or actually probably July or so, once I had been to that rock festival, and once, and made the first payment on my on my apartment, I was hurting for money. So that GI Bill was it was my basically my income at that point. I picked up a job for a little while as in the gas stations pumping gas. But basically I survived on the GI Bill, which wasn't a whole hell of a lot. But in those days, I paid for a full year's tuition at LSUNO, and it was a couple $100. It was a totally different situation than the situation that you have these days. The tuition was affordable at state schools. The tuition was was very affordable, and I think I got out of that. I think I was paying $90 a month for the apartment in the down in the French Quarter, which was really too much for me at that time. And so I ended up, I hooked up with two other guys that I met, one of whom was a Vietnam veteran, and the three of us got a 3-room apartment down on off of St. Charles Avenue, and we paid $150 a month for it, so it was $50 a piece. So I cut $40 off that. Yeah.
So what period of time are we talking about at this point? Are we into 1972 yet, or late 71? No,
this is late 71. So this was Veterans Day 71. So November 71. And it was basically, for a lot of the guys who got arrested, there were 33 of us who got arrested. Everybody did it just because, they were pissed off, but that was really the high point of VBAW in New Orleans. We were able to, we got a lot of local publicity. It was in the papers, on the news, so that the city had kind of a black eye a little bit. So they and of course New Orleans does parades. That's what they do in New Orleans, parades. So they let us have our own parade a few weeks later. We got a fairly decent turnout, but most of the guys, most of the 33, just sort of, disappeared into the night. The idea of getting arrested, was a little bit more than most of them had bargained for. And then Don Donner, the Arkansas guy, was heading back to Arkansas, so he appointed this other guy, Al, as sort of the Louisiana regional coordinator. And, Al wanted to be a filmmaker, so he dropped out of school and was heading to either New York or Los Angeles or something to try to out his chops as a filmmaker. So I was about the only other guy around who was even showing up to meetings in those days. So almost by default, I became Louisiana regional coordinator for Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Here I was, the non-leader in this leadership position again. So I didn't do, I did about the only thing that happened there. There was one of the local television stations did an editorial against amnesty for draft resistors. And in those days, you could, if they did, an editorial, you could call in and say, I want to do a response. So I did a response to their editorial as the head of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. But that was pretty much all we did. I guess it was February of 1972. In those days, the National VBAW organization had these quarterly National Steering Committee meetings where all of the regional coordinators from all the various parts of the country would get together for 2 or 3 days in some, at some designated spot, and sort of do the organizational business. I think mostly it was like guys just like to travel. I think it was February of 1972. There was a National Steering Committee meeting in Boulder, Colorado. So I decided, hey, regional coordinator for Louisiana. I'm part of the National Steering Committee as a regional coordinator. So I went to this meeting in Boulder, Colorado. That's where I first met John Niffen, and I first met Scott Camille at that meeting. And it was totally chaotic. I mean, you had all of the, I mean, in those days, the majority of members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War were combat vets, because they were the ones who were probably most disillusioned. And so they were the ones who would join BVAW. So so you had, mostly combat vets, many of whom had returned from Vietnam in the last couple of years. All kinds of, alcohol, drugs, whatever, being partaken of, raging PTSD all over the place. And we're trying to have this organizational meeting to try to, and there were some major divisions within the organization. Kerry had already left the organization. He had left the organization at the previous steering committee meeting, which I think was in November of the previous year. He was getting ready for his first congressional run. And there was a lot of, the VVAW had originally started in the Northeast in New York City, and most of the leadership of the organization had remained guys who were from the Northeast. But then after Dewey Canyon 3, the organization really started to expand to all other parts of the country. But then the leadership was remaining in the hands of the Northeast veterans, and more of the veterans from other parts of the country, wanted to get into the national office, into the leadership positions. So there was a lot of friction around that. This was my first meeting. I was trying to be, Mr. I don't know, Robert's Rules of Orders or whatever. So, I was trying, the first day was just like complete chaos. So I stayed up most of the first night, sort of trying to write all of these resolutions, which, listening to all the sides and trying to figure out resolutions which would kind of accommodate the various different points of view. And so the second day I kind of presented them. And a lot of them were passed. Of course, none of them were ever implemented because nobody was taking any notes. So, so nobody ever knew what was really going on. Then I think it was like either the second night or the third night or something. The film, The Winter Soldier Investigation, had just been completed, and one of the guys from the national office, this guy Al Hubbard, who he wasn't there for the first couple of days, and a lot of the anger about the national office was directed at Al. Al was, he was a guy who wasn't necessarily into, sort of collective action. He was into, I know what's best, and I'm gonna make you do what, and he was good. He was an excellent organizer. A lot of the stuff that, Kerry didn't really organize things. He just sort of showed up to things that Hubbard organized and became the media star because he was the white officer and Al Hubbard was the black enlisted guy. So Hubbard really didn't get a lot of credit, but he got a lot of the grief. He didn't have a particularly sociable manner about him. But he showed up on the second or third day with the first copy of Winter Soldier Investigation. And he managed to deflect all of the anger against himself at that point by saying, "Hey, let's watch the movie." and of course, Scott Camille was the star of the movie, star if you want to call it that. And then by chance, I flew out to that steering committee meeting. I had no idea how I was getting back. I had no money in my pocket. I used all my money to buy the plane ticket. And actually, Scott Camille and the group that he was there with said that, well, they would be driving back to Florida and they could give me a ride as far as they could go, and then I just have to get home from there. And so they got me fairly close, maybe. I forget where they dropped me off, but then I hitchhiked back down into New Orleans. And then there was a couple of months later, again, not much was happening in Louisiana as far as VBAW was concerned. And a few months later, there was another steering committee meeting in Houston, Texas. And so I went over to the steering committee meeting in Houston, Texas. And again, this was probably March or April of 1972 or something like that. Maybe, no, it had to be March or April, something like that. And so a lot of the same types of divisiveness and for whatever reason, a lot of the sort of schisms or the problems within BVAW tended to sort of align themselves along north-south lines. So it was the Southern regional coordinators who had a lot of stuff against the northern guys who were controlling the organization at that time. So I think in Houston, this new structure came up. There would be five national coordinators who would be elected from various regions of the country, and they would then become the primary group that would lead the organization forward. And so, I mean, it wasn't like anybody or everybody was interested in that job, because that it meant then giving up whatever you were doing locally and then going to New York City to serve in the national office. So I sort of let people know that it's something that I could possibly be interested in. And in some ways I was the perfect compromise candidate, because I was a Southern regional coordinator who was born in Brooklyn, although Scott was born in Brooklyn also. But so I was from the North, but I was considered a Southern regional coordinator. So I was something of a compromise candidate. And so I was elected as one of the 5 national coordinators of BVAW. So again, the anti-leader, non-leader, put himself into a leadership position for some reason or other. So I went back to Louisiana. I dropped out of school, got in my Volkswagen bus, and drove to New York City, and basically lived in the national office of BVAW. Was an office space on West 26th Street. It was actually in the building right next to the Communist Party headquarters, which a lot of people tried to make something out of. But I literally lived I had no place to live in. I had no money. I think I got $25 a week as a national coordinator. Once I dropped out of school, I lost my my veterans benefit. And so I basically lived in a closet in the national office the next several months. And ask me another question, or I'll keep going.
Well, I'm trying to say, because this will eventually make its way to the Library of Congress, and I know there's this big thing in here that we already have a couple of hours on what happened with the quote unquote Gainesville Eight and the trial, which is not part of that collection. I don't know if it could be or not, but perhaps we could address. It was possible to do an abridged version of that, but this is your story, so that part, you're the editor of this. But I would very much like to find out, what your life has been as well. And we do this with all the veterans we interview. What's happened since then? What's happened since your service?
Right.
To today, type of thing. So, however you want to deal with those. We can do.
All right,
that.
let me try to give you as abridged version as I can of Gainesville Eight. So that year, this was 1972. Both of the political conventions for the Democratic and the Republican parties were both scheduled for Miami Beach, Florida. And, similar to 1968, there were major anti-war demonstrations that were planned around both conventions. So obviously, because they were both in Florida, the VBAW folks in Florida were on the front lines as far as all of the organizing aspects of organizing for these two major demonstrations. But of course, the national office wanted to keep their finger in that thing. So there was a meeting that was being scheduled in Gainesville, Florida, where a lot of the sort of the logistics and other elements of sort of organizing these demonstrations was going to take place. So I was the natural sort of delegate from the national office to go down to this meeting in Gainesville, Florida. Excuse me, that was sort of doing a lot of the planning for the demonstrations at the conventions. So I hopped in my Volkswagen van and headed on down there. And in addition to planning for the conventions, Scott Camille had also sort of organized a sort of Southern Regional Coordinators meeting. So John Niffen and Bill Patterson and a couple of other guys from Texas showed up. Bill Leamer, who at that point was the regional coordinator for Arkansas, also showed up. And then a lot of the local VBAW coordinators from Florida were there. So it was a large bunch of people. There were two guys from Louisiana who I had known during my time there, who had not been invited, but who ended up showing up to the meeting anyway. One named Carl Becker and the other named Art France. Art France claimed to be a veteran. Becker did not claim to be a veteran, but he was sort of a movement gadfly in the New Orleans area. And I had sort of befriended him. We used to hang out together and stuff. But they ended up showing up at the meeting. And so, Scott said, "Can you vouch for these guys?" And, I hadn't invited them. I didn't know what they were doing there. I didn't know why they were there. I didn't know how they knew to get there. And I said, "No, I can't vouch for these guys." So they weren't allowed in the meeting, so the meeting, okay, two things. Number one, one of the things I learned as a result of the Gainesville 8 trial is that there are as many versions of an event as there are people who participated in it. Okay. So, and because each of you come to the event with your own personal experiences, your own personal interpretation of things, and that's how you see what happened. And it can be very different. I remember there were so my recollection of the things that happened around Gainesville meeting are very different from the recollections of some of the other participants, primarily because we're each filtering it through our own set of experiences. So this is not what I would say. This is what happened at the Gainesville 8. This is what I experienced as what happened at the Gainesville meeting. So as I remember, we went. There was a lot of people. Most of them were local Florida folks of that Scott had brought up, local city coordinators in various cities of Florida. And we were all up in Scott's attic where the meeting took place. And as I remember, probably, 75, 80% of the meeting was just all of the the sort of the mundane organizing things that are associated with having large amounts of people in the same place at the same time to have a demonstration. Do we have parade permits? Do we have porta-sands? What, how do we have permission to camp in the park? How are we going to deal with the other organizations that are down there? All that kind of stuff. At some point during the meeting, again, my recollection is that the direction of this was primarily sort of instigated and pushed by Bill Leamer, the Arkansas Regional Coordinator. But it was a natural conversation given the types of violence that had happened at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, and the fact that most anti-war people pretty much thought that it was a police riot rather than a demonstrator riot. So people, there were concerns, well, what's going to happen at the conventions in Miami Beach in 1972. And so there was always a lot of talk, what's going to happen with the police, and there were all kinds of rumors that the Miami Beach police were getting M16s and blah blah blah. And again, my recollection is that Bill Leamer was sort of spinning out these what if scenarios. What if the police do this? Then what are we going to do? What if the police do this? Then what are we going to do? Kind of thing. You have a room full of altered state Vietnam veterans. And so when somebody like Bill Leamer comes up with a scenario, what if the police shut down all the bridges to Miami Beach and start shooting demonstrators? Then what are we going to do? Well, we came up with an appropriate response to that scenario. Okay, so clearly there was talk, and the interesting thing about conspiracy is that we were charged with conspiracy to incite a riot, conspiracy does not, normally conspiracy is a secondary charge to you're actually doing what you conspire to do. So conspiracy is the planning of it, and then you're then ultimately charged with actually doing what you plan to do. So you robbed a bank and you conspired to rob the bank. You plan to do it. Okay, but what the government in those days had started to do was they started to use the conspiracy charge separate from the actual event itself. So you didn't have to do the event. You didn't have to actually undertake the illegal thing that supposedly you were planning to do. All they have to do is prove that you were planning to do it, and that you committed two what they were called overt acts, which were things that you did, which they could prove were in furtherance of actually doing the thing that you were conspiring to do. I mean, my overt acts, I had two overt acts in the indictment. One was traveling from New York City to Gainesville, Florida, and the other one was attending a meeting in Gainesville, Florida. Two perfectly legal acts. But if the government had been able to prove that those acts were in furtherance of this conspiracy that they said we were planning to undertake, then I could have gone to jail for 5 years. So anyway, the big question is, of all the things that we talked about at that meeting, how much was realistic, and how much were people really going to do if the situation presented itself? And I think that's where there's a lot of difference of opinion in terms of what people thought they would be willing to do at that point. So after the meeting, Scott said that he had to go down to Miami. There was a meeting of all the various anti-war organizations getting together, to talk about how they were going to coordinate actions. And also apparently there had been some rumors that there was this right-wing Cuban group that was planning on trying to disrupt the demonstrations. So so Scott wanted to see if he could make contact with this Cuban group to try to head off any problems. So he went down. So and Scott said, "You want to come along?" So I said, "Sure, I'll come along." So we went down there. We attended the meeting of all of these anti-war groups, which again was another typical movement clusterfuck, but I won't get into that. And then Scott was able to set up a meeting with this right-wing Cuban group. And so again, we met him on a street corner. We went there saying, look, we don't want any trouble. We want to keep things cool, and that was basically what we were saying to them. And after, Scott gave his little, peace, love, dope, good, peace, love, good vibes speech, one of the Cubans said, "Hey, I can get you a case of hand grenades for $300, and Scott said, "Well, yeah, we're actually not interested in buying any hand grenades." And and that was sort of the end of the end of the meeting. I went back to New York, and then so the Democratic convention was first. The Democratic convention was in July of that year, and as many remember, June 17th of 1972 was the day that the burglars were caught in the Watergate. And interestingly enough, one of the first defenses that they came out with, and actually James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, testified to this during the Watergate hearings, was that they had information that that individuals within the Democratic Convention were working together with outside groups who were planning to violently disrupt the Republican convention, and that's why they went into the Democratic headquarters to bug them, because they wanted to get information on this. So this was June 17th. On July 1st, grand jury was convened in Tallahassee, Florida. Shortly after that, 23 members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War were subpoenaed to appear before this grand jury. Everybody was subpoenaed to appear on the same day at the same time. I was one of the 23, along with Scott, John Niffen, a number of other people. So I was served my subpoena, and the grand jury, and we were all subpoenaed to appear on the morning of the first day of the Democratic Convention. So it essentially eliminated all of us from attending the demonstrations during the Democratic Convention. The national office contacted some lawyers in New York City, a group called the Center for Constitutional Rights, who were some civil rights lawyers who had done a lot of work with VVAW in the past, and also with other groups, had defended the Berrigans during the Harrisburg 7 trial. And so that the Center for Constitutional Rights sent a couple of lawyers down to Tallahassee, Florida, to essentially represent some or all of the 23 who had been subpoenaed. The lawyers got down there, and and then there's like these 23 veterans, 23 people kind of hanging out in the hallway outside the grand jury room, and every 5 minutes, one of them would come up and say, "I think so-and-so's an informer. I think so-and-so's an informer." So, and of course, the lawyers didn't know any of the people there. So what the lawyers did was they got everybody together. They made a little speech, and they had everybody sort of sign a consent form saying, "I agree for you to be my lawyer for purposes of the grand jury." And they had all of the people sign those, basically those retention slips. So the next day they went into court and they were able to get the judge to put the government prosecutor, a guy by the name of Guy Goodwin, on the stand under oath. Then they read out the names of all of the people who had signed these slips. And they specifically asked Guy Goodwin under oath, are any of these people agents or informers of the United States government? And Guy Goodwin testified under oath that none of those were agents or informers of the government. It turns out that two of them were. But that's so the grand jury went through the grand jury process. Everybody refused to testify. Several people were given immunity. They still refused to testify. Those people who were given immunity who refused to testify were put in jail for about a month or 6 weeks, I forget, like that. And then on the last day, 3 days later, on the last day of the Democratic Convention, about 2 hours after we were able to get a resolution on the floor of the Democratic Convention condemning the grand jury as a political use of the grand jury then indicted 6 of us for conspiracy to incite a riot at the Republican convention, which had not yet happened, was going to happen in August. I was one of those 6. I remember we were staying in, or we were meeting in a hotel somewhere in Tallahassee, and the meeting was over, and I was going up to the parking area for the hotel was on the roof, and I was going up to the parking area on the roof to get my car to drive back to where I was staying. And these 2 guys in suits approached me, asked me my name, and I told them my name, and they arrested me for conspiracy to incite a riot. Was in jail for a couple of days before they raised bail. Subsequently, 2 more people were indicted. 2 of the people who had refused to testify, they then subsequently indicted them. So we became the Gainesville 8 rather than originally there was 6. So this was all happening in, I guess, the summer of 1972. The trial itself happened in August of 1973, so it was a year later. Our lawyers tried very hard to make the connection. It turned out that those Cubans that we met in Miami Beach were very closely connected to the Cubans who had been arrested in the Watergate. Then during the Watergate hearings in the spring of 73, James McCord specifically mentioned the Gainesville 8 as proof of the fact that the Democratic Party was associating with people who were going to commit violence at the Republican convention, which gave them the justification for going in there to try to bug it. Our lawyers tried very hard to make the connection between the two, the timeline, and some of the characters in both of them were the same. They were able to get the then former Attorney General John Mitchell, who at that time was under indictment and just about ready to go to jail. They were able to get him, force him to come down to Tallahassee, Florida to testify at a pretrial hearing. The judge totally protected him, wouldn't let our lawyers ask him any substantive questions, and was totally obsequious to him. And he just basically got there, didn't say a word, and left. So the trial happened in August of 1973. So for a year between the indictment and the trial, I was basically what you would call a professional defendant. So most of my life was taken up traveling around, giving speeches about the case, trying to raise money, because all the lawyers were basically working pro bono without pay. but there were huge expenses associated with, filing briefs and other things. So we were trying to raise money to help defray some of those costs. And then so originally we were confined. Our bail confined us to the Northern District of Florida, but then the lawyers were able to go to appeals court and get that part overturned. Once I was allowed to freely move, I went back up to New York City, and was living there until the trial. The trial took place over about 4 weeks in Gainesville. The government's case consisted almost exclusively of the testimony of agents and informers. It turns out that both Art France and Carl Becker, the two gentlemen that I knew from Louisiana, were both undercover agents. Becker testified at the trial. And he was it's interesting because a lot of the other sort of informers, agents and informers, they basically told the truth. Now, they slanted it in a certain way and tried to make it sound, but they basically told the truth. Okay. Becker just completely lied. We called him the prosecution garbage man. There were all sorts of wild accusations in the in the indictment that they didn't have a shred of evidence for. And so, Becker just testified to all of it, whatever they needed. He just said, oh yeah, that happened. Supposedly in Gainesville, he wasn't in the meeting, but then he said, well, I had a conversation with him after the meeting, and I told him everything that happened, and that I was, and that I was now going to be a violent person because that was the only way to change things. So, Emerson Poe, who was a very good friend of Scott Camille, who actually worked on our defense committee up until the day before he testified. He was also one of the people who signed one of these agreements. Art France was one of the people who signed one of these agreements with the lawyers. Both of them turned out to be agents of the government. I mean, with Poe, Poe's wife had a miscarriage, and Scott Camille and his girlfriend went over to the house and took care of their kids while they were in the hospital. And it turned out that that Emerson Poe was a government informer the whole time. After the government basically put on about 4 weeks of testimony of informers. At the end of that, we had a real dilemma. Number one, we didn't feel that the government had really proved anything. They hadn't even spent the time to get all of their agents and informers to kind of get their stories straight and to align their stories. And so everybody just told their own story, and they were contradicting one another. I don't remember this, but Scott thinks that at least one informer was testifying against another informer. Bill Leamer turned out to be an informer. He testified against us at the trial. So we didn't feel like they had proved their case. And there was another thing that was going on, which was that we couldn't agree on if we were going to put on a case, what was it we were going to say? Usually in an anti-war trial like this, when you put on your case, that's when you try to, sort of make your political points and whatever. And so we absolutely could not agree on what it was, if we put on a defense, what it was that we would say. It ran the gamut from some defendants wanted to deny everything and say none of this is true, to at least one or two of the defendants who wanted to put on a case saying, yeah, we plan to do it, but it's okay because we're revolutionaries. So
if I understand it, none of you testified, or am I getting ahead of the game?
No, I mean, that's what I'm getting to. We ended up, primarily because we couldn't agree, but also because we felt that the prosecution really hadn't proven their case in any way, shape, or form. The combination of those two things, we ultimately voted to not put on a defense. Now, we did put on a small defense because Scott Camille had, in addition to the conspiracy charge, Scott Camille had 2 additional charges against him and only him, which were teaching the use of a firebomb and demonstrating and actually, exploding a firebomb. So we ended up putting on a chemist, a sort of professional one who testified specifically that even if Scott had done that under the law, what he demonstrated and exploded was not considered a firebomb under the statute that they were trying to charge him on. So that was the only witness that we put on for the defense. And then we rested the case. There was another element to this, which is that the jury had been sequestered the entire time. And so, when our lawyer announced that that we were not going to put on a defense, she sort of started that by saying, "We have some very good news for the jury. We're not going to put on a defense, so you're going to be going home very soon."
You could interpret that 2 ways, and that's something of a risk to say that.
Yeah, it was, but so anyway, we rested our case. The closing arguments were in the morning, and then by 11 or 12 o'clock, probably by about 11 or so, closing arguments had done. The judge had given the instructions to the jury, and the jury had retired to undertake their verdict. Now that there's several stories, some of which may be apocryphal, some may not. But one of the stories was that there were a couple of guys on the jury who wanted to, they wanted to kind of do their due diligence kind of thing. So they wanted so they asked for transcripts of some of the testimony of some of the informers. And then apparently they had some problems. And it turned out that they didn't have transcripts of that testimony. And once that happened, it was like, they said, forget about it, But then apparently there was one, again, according to some sources, one of the jurors was a Black Vietnam veteran. And so that by noon or 1 o'clock, the jurors were ready to find us not guilty. But this guy said, "Hey, look, if we hang out for a couple more hours, we'll get at least one more meal on the government." So he basically convinced the jury to not come in with the not guilty verdict right away, so that they could get one more government paid meal. So about 4 hours, it was about 4 or 5 hours, I forget the exact time frame. And the jury came back in and found us all not guilty of all charges.
Amazing. We have that boilerplate of questions I gave you. One of them is a very simple question, and I realize from 1973 to the present is a long time. But one of the questions we ask is, what have you done since then? In other words, your service. But of course, the trial and your membership in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. We can tie these into a number of questions. How does that inform your life? That whole experience, both the service experience and that experience, and how has it informed your life, and how, what have you done, what did you do personally and professionally since then?
Okay. It's not gonna be easy to do a short version of this. So I'll for 10 years after the trial, I was, I was totally out of it. The sort of the quick in succession, Vietnam, BBAW, Gainesville 8, friends turning out to be informers. That whole thing just, was just overwhelming for me. So really for 10 years after the trial, I was, I always worked. I always had a job. But it was always a low-level job. I had a job. I was a pari-mutuel clerk for off-track betting in New York City for a number of years. I worked as a waiter. I worked as a room service waiter. I worked for a moving company doing moving stuff. So I always worked, but I always had low-level jobs that allowed me to be stoned all day, every day. For 10 years, I would wake up in the morning and have the triple C breakfast, vitamin C, cannabis, and caffeine. So I would have a joint with my first cup of coffee in the morning, and I would be stoned all day, every day for like 10 years. That's how I lived my life. I was involved in various different, and I saw myself as like outside of the mainstream, and I reveled in being there. I'm not, one of these. I'm not part of the mainstream at all, and I don't want to be there. I maintained a certain level of activism. With some friends of mine, we started a community newspaper in the neighborhood that we lived in Brooklyn. It was a neighborhood of Park Slope. We called the newspaper Up the Slope. So I did that for a while. Never made any money at it, but it was, it was like a little hobby that we did. The other thing that was happening to me, which had already been happening in my life, but that then started to become a disturbing pattern, which is that, I would sort of follow a path, and then I would suddenly wake up one morning and say, and just like be totally fed up with that path, and just like totally change my life in a different direction. That's what I did when I first left home. I was going to college. I was, I was the kid, doing everything was right. And then I just woke up one morning and suddenly I was on the road hitchhiking around the country. I did that when, I was going to school after Vietnam, and then suddenly I walked in one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to go to New York and be a national coordinator for Vietnam Veterans Against the War." In the middle 70s, somewhere about 77 or so, 76. I woke up one morning. I was in New York. I was working as a cashier at off-track betting. I was involved in all kinds of activist things. I was doing this newspaper. I was involved in an activist, a street theater group. All these things. I woke up one day, took the $70 that I had in the bank, got on a bus, and went back to New Orleans, and lived down in New Orleans for another few years. And then just one day woke up in New Orleans and drove back up to New York City.
Did you go back to school at all? I mean, either New Orleans or after that, or?
Yeah, I did. I've never graduated from college. I went to a bunch. Let's see. After LSU and I went to City University in New York. I went to Hunter College. I went to Brooklyn College. I went to NYU. Maybe one or two other ones in there. But I never graduated from any of them.
Okay.
State University of New York at Old Westbury.
Yeah.
And, so I didn't, I was just, I know the early 80s, I had this new girlfriend, and I was trying to get my life together. The early 80s was sort of when, after going through the late 70s, where the Vietnam veteran was, if you needed a villain in your TV show or your movie, and you needed a crazy, violent guy. You just made him a Vietnam veteran, and it was like, everybody knew why, So, but then sort of coming into the early 80s, so actually it was after the Iran hostage thing. Then, when the Iran hostages came back and they were getting all these accolades, and somebody started saying, well, what about Vietnam veterans? And so suddenly in the early 80s, there was like this turnaround in terms of feelings towards Vietnam veterans. And that, and then the sort of the national Vietnam Veterans Memorial thing got underway, and then they had the big dedication and everything down there. And then a lot of localities started, building their own, making plans for their own Vietnam Veterans Memorials of one sort or another. And the city of New York decided that they were going to build a memorial for Vietnam veterans. Actually, the New York one was for Vietnam era veterans, so that they could be more inclusive, not just those who served the country. And so there were, so the mayor, Ed Koch was the mayor at the time. And so he formed this memorial commission, which was basically sort of a conglomeration of 100 citizens, half of whom were Vietnam veterans, half of whom were not Vietnam veterans. And the idea was that they would then raise private money. The city donated a park in New York City that they would make Vietnam Veterans Park, where we could build the memorial. Interestingly enough, one of the co-chairs of the commission was one Donald Trump. He was so he was, so the way they set it up was that there was sort of a Vietnam veteran was paired with a non-Vietnam veteran. So they had a Vietnam veteran investment banker who was the other guy named Scott Higgins, who was the other co-chair, and he was co-chair with Donald Trump. There were two staff positions. It turned out three when we finally put on an executive director and a deputy director. Although actually there was only an executive director position, which was actually going to be a paid staff position. And so I applied for executive, why not? Hey, I'll apply for the executive director. I had no resume whatsoever. I was basically working as a waiter at the time. Actually by that time I was working for a moving company. But I went in and I interviewed, and I do good interviews. So I went in and the guys who were sort of doing it, I blew them away, but they had already kind of had in mind the guy that they wanted to be the executive director. So then they created this deputy director job and they gave it to me. So and then later on, the guy who was the executive director ultimately left, and then I became the executive director. So we ended up raising over $2 million in private funding to fund this Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and so I was. It was interesting because I worked. There was an executive committee, which was all of these Vietnam veterans, highly successful Vietnam veterans, investment bankers and the heads of advertising agencies, and one guy was the head of publicity for CBS News, and all of these hugely successessful Vietnam veterans, and I was trying to fit in, and I was, well, what have you done, Peter? Oh, gee, I was a waiter for 2 years, I was one of the Gainesville Eight, hey, so I was in a constant prove myself, feeling like I was trying to prove that I belonged with all of these highly successful vets. They all had full-time jobs, and so I became their very efficient, but I became their tool. So all of the things they needed done, I was the guy who did it. So I organized the design, so we had a design competition to choose the design for the memorial. So I organized a whole design competition, got the people together who actually judged the competition. And then the design that was chosen was a glass block wall on that would be illuminated from the inside, but etched on the glass blocks would be actual letters that had been sent to and from Vietnam veterans and their friends and family. So once we chose that as the design, then it's Peter, go get us some letters. So I then had to organize the effort to get the letters. So we and the thing was that the winning design was announced in May of 1984, and they decided that they wanted to May 15th of 1985 was the 10th anniversary of the official end of the Vietnam War. So they decided that's the day we want to dedicate the memorial. So, so we had 1 year to gather letters, choose the letters, and build the glass block wall on which the letters would be etched. So one of my jobs was to gather the letters. Through the summer of '84, I did a nice poster, sent it out to all Vietnam veterans groups around. Did some speaking gigs. And by September or so, we had maybe 100 letters. And some were good, some were the one thing you got more than anything else from the letters was, these were ordinary people, doing extraordinary things. So anyway, when we announced the design, the guy named David Dunlap, who was a reporter for the New York Times, at the time he was basically the City Hall reporter for the New York Times, and he said, gee, when you get some of these letters, I'd like to take a look at them. So in September we had about 100 letters. So I took, maybe about the best 10 or 15 letters that we had, and I sent them to Dunlap. And he sorry.
Hey, we can break if you want.
No, I can go. Just let me take a water.
Yeah.
Dunlap printed the letters, got the Times to print the letters verbatim, starting on page B1 of the Times. And then, so half of B1 and another half a page on the inside of the B section. Plus, there was a picture of one of the guys who had written the letters that he had gotten. And that was, admiringly said by the Vietnam veteran who was the advertising executive, above the fold, which is apparently that's the place to be in New York, because the Times is folded in half. So anything that's above the fold, that's what people see. So that there was a picture.
Yes.
There was a picture on the front page, a picture of this guy, above the fold, and then half of page B1 and half of another page inside the B section. And the best thing was that Dunlop, there was just like a little introductory paragraphs, and then just printed the letters verbatim. And he printed the address where you could send letters, and that went out on the Times Wire. We, within 2 months, we had over 3,000 letters.
Wow.
From like 48 states and 6 foreign countries. We had, and we had 6 book publishers who offered to do a book of the letters. And so the process, which I am very happy that I was involved in, of actually choosing the letters for the memorial, it was just a bunch of Vietnam veterans. And it was tough because, in those days, it was on the outer edge of, there was still a lot of raw feelings about Vietnam, and even within our group, the sort of the group of people who were very active. There was about maybe 8 or 9 people who were very active. There were, the political opinions about the war were all over the map. And this was a big concern that I had and that other people had, which was, how do you take these letters? Because we had material, we had 3,000 letters. We could have made any kind of political statement in any way, shape, or form, if that was the desire of the group. And to the credit of the executive committee, I mean, there were major political divisions after the whole thing was over, but everybody stayed totally together. And our idea was this: just tell the truth, And me coming from an anti-war position, that was perfect for me, because I figured, if we just tell the truth by its nature is anti-war. So if we just tell the truth, my message is out there, So, and that's what we did. So that we basically chose excerpts from the letters, interspersed with sort of little news blurbs from the time to provide a little bit of context. And they were etched on the memorial. It's still there. We did a book called Dear America, Letters Home from Vietnam. And then a couple of years later, HBO ended up doing a documentary film called Dear America, where they basically read the letters behind documentary footage of the war. The memorial was dedicated in May of 1985, May 15th, 1985. There was a ticker tape parade for Vietnam veterans. I had issues with the ticker tape parade, although I did march in it. But I understood, within the context of the time, I basically understood that all of this sort of adulation that was suddenly coming the way of Vietnam veterans was a double-edged sword. Number one, after having been, basically shit upon for 10 years, it felt good, and it felt good for a lot of veterans. But I also understood that part of it was trying to change the story about Vietnam, to change the lesson of Vietnam, And so the original lesson, which we should have learned from Vietnam, is don't send American troops to foreign countries to fight and die and kill for something that has absolutely nothing to do with American security. That was the lesson we should have learned from Vietnam. But the lesson that they changed it to, and that this memorial and other memorials and a lot of what was going on in the early 80s, what they changed that lesson to is support the troops. And that became the lesson of Vietnam: support the troops. And it's you don't care what the troops do, and even almost anybody who, even anti-war people, these days say, well, I support the troops, but, and it's like, but my question is, how do you support the troops without support what the troops are doing? And if you don't agree with what the troops are doing, how can you support the troops? It's not an easy question to answer, and I don't necessarily have the answer to that. But so I was not for the ticker tape parade at all. I didn't do any work on the ticker tape parade. But it went off, and it was good. I mean, I think it was good for the people who, most of the Vietnam veterans who were in the parade had already dealt one way or another with their Vietnam experience, and they didn't need a ticker tape parade, to help them process Vietnam. But I think that, perhaps one of the things the ticker tape parade did was for the people on the sidelines. It just gave some people, ordinary people, an opportunity to express their appreciation in the way they never were able to do before. So. Okay, so I did that. And after that whole thing was over, I was offered the job of Veterans Coordinator for the city of New York. And I made a conscious decision at that point, because up until that point, my primary identification was Vietnam veteran. If you met me within 3 minutes of having met me, you would have known that I was a Vietnam veteran, because I would have told you that's who I was. But I guess for me, the Memorial Commission, one of the things that did was it sort of settled for me that it was time for me to put the Vietnam experience in its place in my life and get on with things, And so I realized that I didn't want to become a professional veteran. I didn't want that to be, I didn't want Vietnam veteran to be my primary identification for the rest of my life. So I went out, so I respectfully declined the position, and I went out to look for something else. And I ended up as an investment banker on Wall Street. There are a lot of Vietnam veterans who worked on Wall Street. We did a lot of fundraising on Wall Street, usually trying to identify the Vietnam veteran within a particular firm, using him as an in and to get the donation. So I made a lot of contacts. So I was just looking around for, what am I going to do after this Memorial Commission thing is over? And so one of the people that I had met said, well, I could get you this interview, with this investment banking firm. And I was, sure, what the hell, I'll practice my interview techniques. It's like, this will be fun. It'll be a little lark. And so it's probably because I went in there, I knew I wasn't going to get the job. So I was just having a good time, and I was totally relaxed and, just going along, and they freaking hired me. So I did that for 2 years, and until the market crashed in '87. And that was the end of my Wall Street career. During that time, I was sort of, the Vietnam thing didn't quite leave me totally. I ended up getting chosen to be part of a delegation of Vietnam veterans that in 1980, I guess 87 sometime, that went to the Soviet Union to meet with Soviet Afghanistan veterans. That the Soviet Afghanistan veterans were having a lot of the PTSD types of problems that that Vietnam veterans had gone through. There was this group called Earth Stewards Network out of Seattle, Washington, which had been organizing sort of exchange groups of Russians and Americans under various types of, farmers or, whatever type, that type of stuff. And while they were there on one of these trips, there was, they were approached by some Afghanistan veterans saying, could you bring a delegation of Vietnam veterans over here? And so there was the first delegation, and there was specifically sort of veteran professional, like mental health professionals and that type of thing. And then there was a second group of which I was a part, which is a little more diverse. And so, I went to the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and met with Soviet Afghanistan veterans. We then had, we brought some of them back over here to the United States, to get them to visit the United States. Then a bunch of Vietnam veterans and Afghanistan veterans ran together in the Moscow Marathon in, I think, 1990. During this time, after my my stint as an investment banker, my boss was on the board of directors of this foreign policy research center called the Institute for East-West Security Studies. And I ended up getting a job with them as director of administration. And so I worked there for about 4 years. And, so I sort of had two connections with Russia. or then the Soviet Union. One was this Afghanistan veterans thing. And then the second was, as things started more and more to open up in the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, then my institute, which had a lot of contacts with Soviets on foreign policy research stuff. We started doing conferences in Moscow and things like that, St. Petersburg, and so I visited Russia also in my job, in addition to this Afghanistan thing. And then in 91 or 92, I was at a certain place in my life. I had been married, and my marriage was breaking up. This was my second marriage, and I was breaking up with my wife, and I'd been at the institute for, I think, 4 years by that time, I had a new boss who come in. I always think that I didn't get along with my boss, and there were all these interesting things that were happening in Russia, and and also it was another perfect drop everything that you're doing and go someplace else and start over. So I dropped everything and I went to Russia, and I lived in Moscow for 9 years. And I met my wife there, my 2 children who were born there. And then I basically ended up getting involved in what's generically called international development, which is basically America gives money to countries overseas to help them try to get better. And in the early middle 90s, they were doing that in Russia until Putin got in and basically kicked all the Americans out. So USAID was very heavily involved in Russia in the early 90s. And so I got a job with an organization that was doing that type of work there. Then when I came back to the United States, I worked for several different organizations doing similar work, basically primarily funded by USAID. First one was an environmental organization. The first one that I came to after coming back from Russia, environmental organization, which was located in Vermont, which is how I ended up now living in Vermont. And then I worked for about 14 years for a health management organization out of Boston. So basically I'm an advisor. Much of my job in this, I'm involved in the contracts side of it. So not so much the substantive side of it, but more the contract side, because if you get money from the U.S. government, then it comes with a stack of regulations about as high as your shoulders. And so my job was to, basically make sure, which was kind of an irony for a guy who spent large portions of his adult life sort of breaking all the rules. And then suddenly big part of my job in my later life was making sure everybody else followed the rules. But I did a lot of traveling. I've been to most countries in South America, most countries in Africa, Philippines, basically all over the globe doing this kind of work. I'm semi-retired now. I do a little bit, 10 to 12 hours of contract work from home, just like writing contracts and that type of thing. So that's what's happened to me since then.
Well, dare I ask, we always ask, is there anything I should have asked and did not? Why didn't he ask that type of thing? Yes.
No, that's okay. I mean, I'm still writing this memoir. I don't know if I'm ever going to be finished it. I can see it in my mind, but getting it from my mind, to the paper is very difficult. So, the sort of the structure of the memoir, it's called Glory Days after the Bruce Springsteen song. And it's juxtaposing sort of episodes in my current life with episodes in my slightly more adventurous younger life, and sort of, juxtaposing my, how did I get from being, Vietnam veteran Gainesville 8 to, a suburban soccer dad, and, sort of trying to make that journey. But anyway, so obviously, I've been thinking about my life and my history and all of the things that have happened to me. So, you don't want to say what else, because I could give you another 3 days of stories. And so I think we're probably, I think this was pretty good. So let's leave it where it's at.
Well, I would like to thank you, Peter Mahoney, and I'm going to put you on pause or stop as far as recording goes, but I would ask you to stay on the line here for a couple more minutes.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you again very much.
You're welcome. It's fun.